Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight we continue our journey through the archives, where every report holds a story not of drama or excitement, but of the patient work of documentation, the careful process of turning human complexity into the orderly language of official records. Let yourself settle into the rhythm of these stories, told not for their action, but for their quiet truth. The report forms from 1988 had a particular weight to them, a heaviness that came not just from the thick paper stock, but from the accumulated gravity of thousands of documented incidents. Detective Lieutenant Margaret Foster had spent the better part of her career filling out these forms, each one a small exercise in translation, converting the raw confusion of human crisis into the structured language that the department required for its records. She sat at her desk on the third floor of the precinct. The building around her settled into its familiar nighttime quiet. The fluorescent lights had been dimmed to their evening setting, casting everything in a softer glow that made the work feel more contemplative, less urgent than the activities of the day shift. Before her lay a stack of completed reports from the previous week, each one ready for review and filing. Each one representing hours of careful observation and methodical documentation. The first report dealt with the disturbance at the Riverside Apartments, a sprawling complex that housed primarily elderly residents on fixed incomes. Officer Thompson had been called to investigate complaints about loud music coming from apartment 3B. But his report revealed a situation far more complex than a simple noise violation. The report began with the standard information: date, time, location, responding officer, nature of complaint. But as Officer Thompson's careful narrative unfolded, the reader could begin to understand the layers of context that surrounded this particular disturbance. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, age 81, had been playing her radio at high volume not to disturb her neighbors, but because her hearing had deteriorated to the point where normal volumes were insufficient for her to enjoy her evening programs. Officer Thompson had documented his conversation with Mrs. Vasquez with the kind of detail that revealed his genuine interest in understanding her situation. She had explained that the radio programs, particularly the evening news and a classical music show that aired at 9 o'clock, had become her primary connection to the outside world since her mobility had become limited. Her children lived in other states, and her circle of local friends had gradually diminished as health problems and relocations had separated her from the social network that had sustained her for decades. The report went on to describe Officer Thompson's investigation of the complaint, including interviews with 3 neighbors who had expressed concern about the noise levels. But rather than simply documenting their complaints, he had taken the time to understand their perspectives. As WELL Mr. Martinez from apartment 3A worked early morning shifts and needed to sleep by 8:30 to maintain his schedule. Mrs. Kim from apartment 3C cared for her infant grandchild several evenings per week and worried that loud music would wake the baby. What emerged from Officer Thompson's careful documentation was not a simple conflict between inconsiderate neighbors, but a community of people with legitimate but conflicting needs, all struggling to maintain their quality of life within the constraints of shared living space. His report detailed the solution he had helped broker. Mrs. Vasquez would use headphones for her evening programs, while her neighbors would help her investigate hearing aid options through the county's Senior Services Program. The report concluded with a note that Officer Thompson had contacted the apartment complex's management company to discuss the possibility of organizing a community meeting for residents to discuss shared concerns and potential solutions. This kind of proactive community engagement was documented throughout his reports, reflecting an approach to police work that saw individual incidents as opportunities to strengthen the social fabric of the neighborhoods he served. Lieutenant Foster moved on to the next report. This one filed by Detective Stevens regarding a series of petty thefts that had occurred at Lincoln Elementary School over a period of several weeks. The thefts themselves were minor lunch money taken from desks, small toys missing from backpacks, occasionally a book or piece of clothing that would disappear, and then sometimes reappear in unexpected locations. Detective Stevens' report demonstrated the particular patience required for cases involving children, where the normal investigative procedures had to be adapted to accommodate the developmental and emotional needs of young witnesses and potential suspects. He had spent several days at the school, not interrogating students, but simply observing the rhythms of classroom life, trying to understand the social dynamics that might be contributing to the thefts. His observations, documented in careful detail, painted a picture of a classroom community under stress. The teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was dealing with budget cuts that had increased her class size beyond manageable levels, while also trying to integrate several students with special needs who required additional attention and support. The thefts seemed to be occurring during periods of transition, when students were moving between activities, going to lunch, or preparing to leave for the daytimes when supervision was necessarily divided among multiple demands. Detective Stevens had worked with Mrs. Rodriguez and the school principal to implement what his report called an environmental approach to theft prevention. Rather than focusing on catching and punishing the individual responsible for the thefts, they had worked together to modify classroom routines in ways that reduced opportunities for theft while also addressing some of the underlying stress factors that might be motivating the behavior. The solution involved reorganizing the classroom storage areas so that personal items were kept in more secure locations, implementing a buddy system during transitions to ensure that no student was left unsupervised with access to others' belongings, and creating additional structured activities during the periods when thefts had been most likely to occur. The report documented the effectiveness of these interventions over a 4-week period, noting not only the elimination of theft incidents, but also improvements in overall classroom behavior and student satisfaction. Mrs. Rodriguez had noted in her feedback to Detective Stevens that the process of working together to solve the theft problem had actually strengthened the sense of community within the classroom, as students had been involved in developing and implementing the solutions. This case exemplified the kind of preventive police work that was documented throughout the reports from this period. Rather than simply responding to crimes after they occurred, officers like Detective Stevens were working proactively to address the conditions that made crimes more likely, treating law enforcement as one component of a larger effort to maintain healthy communities. The next report dealt with a domestic disturbance case that had required multiple visits and extensive documentation over a period of several months. Officer Patricia Wong had been called to the Hartwell residence on Maple Street to mediate what was initially described as a dispute between neighbors, but her careful investigation had revealed a much more complex situation involving family relationships, financial stress, and communication problems that had been building for years. The Hartwell family included 3 generations living in a single household: grandparents Robert and Mary Hartwell, their adult son David and his wife Susan, and David and Susan's 2 teenage children. The initial complaint had come from a neighbor who reported loud arguments and what sounded like furniture being moved or thrown during late evening hours. Officer Wong's first report documented her initial assessment of the situation, including separate interviews with each family member to understand their individual perspectives on the conflicts that were disrupting the household. What emerged was a picture of a family struggling to adapt to economic pressures that had forced them to combine households, creating stress on relationships that had previously been maintained through the buffer of physical distance. Robert Hartwell, age 73, had been the primary breadwinner for the family until his retirement, and he was struggling to adjust to a reduced role in household decision-making while still feeling responsible for everyone's welfare. His son, David, had lost his job at the local manufacturing plant and was working part-time retail while looking for more stable employment, creating financial strain and affecting his sense of identity as a provider for his family. Susan Hartwell was caring for her mother-in-law, Mary, whose health had declined significantly over the past year, while also trying to maintain her own part-time employment and manage the household needs of 6 people. The teenage children, Jennifer and Michael, were dealing with the typical stresses of adolescence, while also adjusting to the loss of privacy and independence that came with the multi-generational living arrangement. Officer Wong's reports documented her patient work with the family over several months, helping them develop communication strategies and household management systems that could accommodate everyone's needs and concerns. She had connected them with family counseling services, financial planning assistance, and respite care resources for Mary's health needs. But the reports also revealed Officer Wong's understanding that her role extended beyond simply referring the family to other services. She had made regular check-in visits, helping the family practice the communication techniques they were learning in counseling and troubleshooting problems as they arose. Her documentation showed a deep commitment to seeing the process through rather than simply responding to crisis calls when tensions escalated. The case file included progress notes from the family counselor, with permission from the family, allowing Officer Wong to coordinate her efforts with the therapeutic interventions. This kind of collaborative approach was documented throughout her reports, reflecting an understanding that complex family problems required comprehensive solutions that drew on multiple forms of professional expertise. The final report in the Hartwell case noted that the family had successfully stabilized their living situation and had not required police intervention for over 6 months. David had found full-time employment, Mary's health had improved with better medical management, and the family had developed routines and communication patterns that allowed them to live together peacefully while maintaining individual autonomy and respect. Lieutenant Foster found herself impressed by the thoroughness and patience that characterized Officer Wong's approach to this case. The reports documented not just the immediate interventions, but the long-term follow-up that ensured the stability of the solutions that had been developed. This kind of sustained engagement represented a significant investment of time and emotional energy, but the results suggested that it was far more effective than the alternative of responding repeatedly to crisis calls from the same household. The next report dealt with a vandalism case at Roosevelt High School, where someone had been spray painting political messages on the exterior walls of the building during weekend nights over a period of several weeks. The investigating officer, Sergeant Michael Chun, had approached the case not as a simple matter of property damage, but as an opportunity to understand and address the underlying tensions that were motivating the vandalism. Sergeant Chun's initial report documented his analysis of the graffiti itself, noting that the messages were not random acts of destruction, but carefully composed political statements that reflected sophisticated thinking about current social and economic issues. The messages addressed topics like unemployment, environmental protection, and social justice, suggesting that the vandal was someone with genuine political concerns, rather than someone simply seeking to cause damage. Rather than focusing immediately on identification and arrest, Sergeant Chun had worked with school administrators to understand the broader context of student political engagement at Roosevelt High School. His interviews with teachers and counselors revealed that many students were feeling frustrated by their perceived lack of voice in political discussions that would significantly affect their futures. particularly regarding economic opportunities and environmental policy. The school had traditionally discouraged political discussion in classroom settings, preferring to maintain what administrators called political neutrality. But Sergeant Chun's investigation suggested that this approach might actually be contributing to the problem by driving political expression underground rather than providing appropriate channels for student engagement with important issues. Working with the school's principal and several teachers, Sergeant Chun had helped develop what his report called a constructive engagement strategy. Rather than simply increasing security to prevent future vandalism, the school had created new opportunities for students to express their political views through appropriate channels, including a student forum for discussing current events and illegal graffiti wall where students could create politically themed artwork with permission and supervision. The report documented the process of implementing these changes over several weeks, including the positive response from students who had been feeling voiceless and frustrated. The vandalism had stopped immediately after the new programs were announced, suggesting that the behavior had indeed been motivated by a desire for political expression rather than a simple intention to cause damage. More significantly, Sergeant Chun's report noted that the school's new approach to political engagement had led to increased student participation in legitimate political activities, including voter registration drives for eligible students and organized discussions with local political candidates. The vandalism case had become an opportunity to strengthen democratic engagement rather than simply to punish unwanted behavior. This case reflected the kind of creative problem-solving that characterized much of the police work documented in these reports. Sergeant Chun had recognized that effective law enforcement often required understanding and addressing the underlying motivations for unwanted behavior rather than simply focusing on punishment and deterrence. The next report involved a more complex investigation into a series of car break-ins that had occurred in the Wenby parking lot of Westfield Community College over a period of several months. Detective Lisa Martinez had been assigned to the case after regular patrols had failed to identify the perpetrator or prevent the continuing incidents. Detective Martinez's approach to the investigation was documented in meticulous detail, reflecting the kind of systematic methodology that was characteristic of effective police work during this period. She had begun by analyzing the patterns of the break-ins, documenting the times, locations, weather conditions, and types of vehicles targeted to identify any factors that might help predict future incidents or narrow the field of potential suspects. Her analysis revealed several interesting patterns. The break-ins occurred primarily during evening hours when the parking lot was well lit but not heavily trafficked, suggesting someone who was familiar with the college's schedules and security procedures. The vehicles targeted were consistently older models that were easier to enter without causing obvious damage, indicating technical knowledge about automobile security systems. Most intriguingly, the items stolen were not the typical targets of car break-ins. Instead of electronic equipment or valuable items left visible in the cars, the thief was taking textbooks, notebooks, and other academic materials. This unusual pattern suggested that the perpetrator might be someone connected to the college community rather than a random criminal. Targeting the parking lot, Detective Martinez had worked with college security to review video footage from the parking lot cameras, but the quality and positioning of the cameras made identification difficult. However, the footage did confirm her analysis of the timing and methods used in the break-ins, providing additional evidence that supported her theory about the perpetrator's connection to the college, rather than relying solely on traditional investigative methods. Detective Martinez had decided to approach the case from the perspective of understanding why someone might specifically target academic materials. Her report documented extensive interviews with college faculty and staff about the pressures facing students, particularly those who were struggling financially to afford the increasing costs of textbooks and educational materials. These interviews revealed that textbook costs had increased significantly over the past several years, creating genuine hardship for students from lower-income families. Several faculty members reported that they were aware of students who were attending classes without required textbooks because they could not afford to purchase them, which was affecting their academic performance and potentially their ability to complete their degree programs. Working with this information, Detective Martinez had developed what her report called a targeted intervention strategy. Rather than simply increasing security in the parking lot, she had worked with college administrators to identify students who might be at risk for this kind of behavior due to financial stress and academic pressure. The breakthrough in the case had come through this proactive approach. A student who had been identified as struggling financially had been approached by a counselor who offered assistance with textbook costs through emergency financial aid program. During this conversation, the student had confessed to the car break-ins, explaining that he had been taking textbooks to sell to used bookstores to generate money for his basic living expenses. Detective Martinez's report documented the tedious resolution of the case through a collaborative approach that addressed both the immediate legal issues and the underlying financial problems that had motivated the crimes. The student was required to pay restitution for the stolen items and perform community service at the college, but he was also connected with financial aid resources and work study opportunities that provided legitimate alternatives to theft. Case had concluded with the development of a college-wide program to provide emergency textbook loans for students facing financial hardship, preventing future incidents while also addressing a broader student welfare issue that had been previously unrecognized by the administration. Lieutenant Foster continued reviewing reports, each one revealing the careful attention to detail and comprehensive approach that characterized police work during this period. The reports demonstrated not just technical competence in investigation and documentation, but genuine understanding of the social context in which crimes occurred and the importance of addressing underlying causes rather than simply responding to symptoms. A report filed by Officer James Rodriguez documented his investigation of a noise complaint that had evolved into a broader examination of quality of life issues in a transitional neighborhood. The initial complaint had come from residents of a quiet residential street who were concerned about increased noise levels from a nearby commercial district that was experiencing rapid development. Officer Rodriguez's investigation had revealed that the noise issues were symptoms of larger changes in the neighborhood's character and demographics. The commercial development was bringing new businesses and increased traffic to an area that had previously been primarily residential, creating tensions between long-term residents who valued quiet and stability and newer residents and business owners who were attracted to the area's growing vibrancy and economic opportunities. Rather than simply measuring noise levels and issuing citations, Officer Rodriguez had organized a series of community meetings where residents, business owners, and city planners could discuss the changes occurring in the neighborhood and work together to develop solutions that balanced different needs and interests. His reports documented these meetings in detail, including the various perspectives that were expressed and the compromises that were developed to address different concerns. Long-term residents were concerned about maintaining the neighborhood's residential character and ensuring that children could play safely in streets that were experiencing increased traffic. Business owners were interested in promoting economic development while being good neighbors to the residential community. The solutions that emerged from these discussions were documented in Officer Rodriguez's final report. including agreements about business hours that would minimize noise during evening and early morning periods, traffic management strategies that would reduce the impact of commercial vehicles on residential streets, and communication protocols that would allow ongoing dialogue between different stakeholder groups as the neighborhood continued to evolve. This case demonstrated the kind of proactive community policing that was characteristic of much of the work documented in these reports. Officer Rodriguez had recognized that his role extended beyond enforcement to include facilitation of democratic processes that allowed community members to work together to address shared challenges. The reports from this period consistently demonstrated this understanding of police work as fundamentally about maintaining and strengthening social cohesion rather than simply enforcing laws. Officers were documenting their efforts to understand the complex social, economic, and personal factors that contributed to problems in their communities, and they were working creatively to address these underlying factors rather than simply responding to their immediate manifestations. Lieutenant Foster found herself moved by the dedication and thoughtfulness that characterized so much of the work documented in these reports. The officers whose work was preserved in these files had clearly understood that effective law enforcement required not just technical skills, but also emotional intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and genuine commitment to the welfare of the communities they served. As she continued through the stack of reports, she noticed recurring themes in the approaches taken by different officers to similar types of problems. There seemed to be an institutional culture that encouraged patience, creativity, and comprehensive problem solving, rather than quick fixes or punitive responses. Officers were given the time and support necessary to develop thorough understanding of the situations they encountered, and they were expected to work collaboratively with other professionals and community members to develop effective solutions. The documentation itself reflected this culture of thoroughness and accountability. Each report was carefully written, with attention not just to the facts of individual cases, but to their broader context and implications. Officers were clearly expected to think critically about their work and to document not just what they had done, but why they had chosen particular approaches and what they had learned from their experiences. These reports represented more than just administrative documentation. They were a form of institutional memory that preserved important lessons about effective police work and community engagement. Reading through them provided insights not just into individual cases, but into the larger question of how law enforcement could best serve the needs of complex, diverse communities. The quiet of the night shift provided the perfect environment for this kind of reflective review. With fewer immediate demands and distractions, Lieutenant Foster could give each report the careful attention it deserved, absorbing not just the specific details, but the broader patterns and principles that they illustrated. The work documented in these reports represented thousands of hours of patient, thoughtful police work, much of it invisible to the general public, but essential to the maintenance of community safety and social order. Each report was a small testament to the dedicated service of officers who understood that their job was not just about enforcing laws, but about helping people live together peacefully and constructively. As the night deepened around her, Lieutenant Foster continued her review, knowing that this careful attention to the documentation of police work was itself an important part of maintaining the standards of professionalism and community service that these reports exemplified. The stories contained in these files would continue to provide guidance and inspiration for future officers, preserving the institutional wisdom that had been accumulated through years of thoughtful, dedicated service to the community. The basement archives extended further than most people realized, stretching back through corridors that seemed to multiply in the dim light, each one lined with metal cabinets that held decades of carefully preserved documentation. Detective Sarah Chun had ventured into the deepest sections tonight, drawn by a curiosity about the oldest files, those from the 1970s and early 1980s that had been moved to these remote storage. areas to make room for more recent cases. The air here was different, heavier with the accumulated weight of time and the particular scent that old paper acquired after years of quiet storage. Each footstep echoed softly in the narrow aisles between filing cabinets, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the steady pulse of the building's ventilation system. The fluorescent lights in this section were older, casting everything in a warmer, more subdued glow that made the work feel almost archaeological, as if she were excavating fragments of the city's forgotten history. Cabinet 2-3 contained files from 1979. Their tabs faded to pale yellow and their edges softened by years of careful handling. Sarah pulled the first drawer open slowly, hearing the familiar whisper of metal against metal, feeling the slight resistance that came from files that had settled into their places over decades of undisturbed rest. The manila folders inside were arranged with the same meticulous care that characterized all police filing systems. But there was something different about these older files, a weight and substance that reflected the more deliberate pace of police work in an earlier era. The first file she examined contained the complete record of a missing person case from the autumn of 1979. Missing person was Margaret Riley, a 43-year-old librarian who had failed to return home from work on a Friday evening in October. The initial report, filed by her husband Thomas after she failed to appear for dinner, was written in the careful longhand that predated the widespread use of typewriters. In police documentation, Officer Daniel Murphy had responded to the initial call, and his report reflected the methodical approach that characterized police work of that period. He had spent nearly 2 hours in the Riley household, not just gathering basic information, but trying to understand the context of Margaret's life, her routines, her relationships, and any factors that might explain her disappearance. The report described Margaret as a woman of precise habits who had worked at the Central Library for 18 years, walking the same route to and from work each day, stopping at the same shops for groceries and personal items, maintaining a social circle that consisted primarily of fellow librarians and members of her church congregation. Her husband described her as reliable and predictable, someone who would never simply fail to come home without calling or leaving some kind of message. Officer Murphy's investigation had begun with the library itself, where he had interviewed Margaret's supervisor and several co-workers to understand her state of mind and activities during her final day at work. The librarians he spoke with described Margaret as seeming normal and cheerful, engaged in her usual tasks of cataloging new acquisitions and helping patrons with research questions. She had mentioned looking forward to the weekend, when she and Thomas planned to drive to the countryside to see the autumn foliage. The file contained detailed maps of Margaret's usual route home, hand-drawn by Officer Murphy, with notations marking every shop, intersection, and potential stop along the way. He had walked the route himself several times at different hours, and on different days, trying to understand what might have caused Margaret to deviate from her normal pattern, or what might have prevented her from completing her journey home. His investigation had expanded systematically to include interviews with shop owners and regular customers along Margaret's route, each conversation documented with the kind of patience that reflected a genuine commitment to understanding every aspect of her disappearance. The baker at Morrison's Bakery remembered seeing Margaret on Friday afternoon, buying her usual weekend supply of fresh bread and chatting briefly about the weather. The pharmacist at Henderson's drugstore confirmed that Margaret had filled her monthly prescription for blood pressure medication, paying with exact change as she always did. But no one had seen Margaret after she left the pharmacy at approximately 4:45 p.m., creating a gap in the timeline that Officer Murphy had methodically worked to understand. His reports documented his efforts to identify every possible witness, every potential source of information that might explain what had happened during the 45 minutes between Margaret's last confirmed sighting and the time she should have arrived home. The breakthrough in the case had come through what Officer Murphy described as persistent attention to detail rather than any dramatic discovery. While reviewing Margaret's recent library activities, he had noticed that she had been researching genealogy, specifically trying to trace her family's immigration history from Ireland. This research had led her to correspond with relatives in Boston whom she had never met, but who had been mentioned in family documents she had discovered among her deceased mother's papers. Following this lead, Officer Murphy had contacted the Boston Police Department, asking them to check with the relatives Margaret had been corresponding with. This inquiry had revealed that Margaret had indeed traveled to Boston, making the trip spontaneously after receiving a letter from her cousin Mary O'Sullivan, who had written to invite Margaret to visit before Mary's upcoming surgery for a serious illness. Margaret had made the decision to travel to Boston immediately after work on Friday, taking a bus from the downtown terminal without having time to contact Thomas before departure. The bus schedule meant that she would not arrive in Boston until late Friday evening, and she had planned to call Thomas once she reached her cousin's house. However, Mary O'Sullivan's condition had worsened suddenly, and she had been hospitalized just hours before Margaret's arrival. The file documented Officer Murphy's patient worked to trace Margaret's movements in Boston, working with local police and hospital staff to understand what had happened after her arrival. Margaret had spent the weekend at Mary's bedside, and the emotional intensity of meeting her cousin for the first time under such difficult circumstances had caused her to lose track of time and her usual attention to communication and schedules. Margaret had finally called Thomas on Sunday evening, tearfully explaining her spontaneous trip and apologizing for the worry she had caused. Officer Murphy's final report noted that Margaret had returned home on Monday evening and that the case had been resolved through patient investigation and interdepartmental cooperation rather than any dramatic intervention. The file included a letter from Thomas Riley, written several months after Margaret's return, thanking Officer Murphy for his thorough and compassionate handling of the case. Thomas had noted that the experience had taught both him and Margaret the importance of communication and had actually strengthened their marriage by helping them understand how much they meant to each other. This case exemplified the kind of methodical police work that characterized the era documented in these older files. Officer Murphy had approached Margaret's disappearance not as a crisis requiring immediate action, but as a puzzle that could be solved through careful attention to detail and systematic investigation. His patient approach had revealed the human complexity underlying what had initially appeared to be a simple missing person case. Sarah moved on to another file, this one documenting a burglary investigation that had stretched across several months in 1979. The case involved a series of break-ins at small businesses in the downtown area, all occurring during late-night hours when the establishments were closed and the streets were largely empty of pedestrian traffic. Detective Robert Chun, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, had been assigned to investigate these burglaries, and his approach reflected the same methodical patience that characterized Officer Murphy's work on the missing person case. Rather than simply responding to each burglary as an isolated incident, Detective Chun had worked to understand the pattern underlying the crimes, looking for connections that might lead to the identification of the perpetrator. His initial analysis, documented in careful detail, had revealed several important patterns. The burglar was targeting businesses that dealt primarily in cash, avoiding establishments that relied heavily on credit card transactions or check payments. The break-ins occurred consistently on weeknight rather than weekend evenings, suggesting someone who was familiar with the different rhythms of downtown business activity throughout the week. Most significantly, the burglar was demonstrating unusual restraint and selectivity. Rather than taking everything of value, the intruder was focusing specifically on cash and small, easily portable items, leaving behind merchandise that would have been worth more money but would have been more difficult to transport or sell without attracting attention. Detective Chun had spent weeks observing the downtown area, during the late evening and early morning hours when the burglaries had been occurring, not looking for the burglar in action, but trying to understand the environment and opportunities that were shaping the criminal activity. His reports described the quiet rhythms of the downtown area after business hours, the patterns of police patrol coverage, the lighting conditions and sight lines that might affect a burglar's choice of targets. This observational work had led Detective Chun to focus his investigation on individuals who had legitimate reasons to be downtown during the hours when the burglaries were occurring. Rather than casting a wide net for potential suspects, he had concentrated on night shift workers, security guards, and delivery personnel who would have been familiar with the area and would not have attracted attention by being present during the relevant time periods. The solution to the case had emerged from this targeted approach. Detective Chun had identified Marcus Williams, a night janitor who worked in one of the office buildings in the downtown area, as someone who had both the opportunity and the knowledge necessary to commit the burglaries. Marcus worked from midnight to 8 a.m., giving him detailed familiarity with the downtown area during the hours when the crimes were occurring. But Detective Chun's investigation had revealed that Marcus's situation was more complicated than simple criminal intent. Marcus was working 2 jobs while attending community college classes during the day, trying to save money to complete his degree in accounting. His wife had been diagnosed with a chronic illness that required expensive medication not covered by their health insurance, creating financial pressures that had led Marcus to make increasingly desperate choices. The burglaries had been Marcus's attempt to generate additional income to cover his wife's medical expenses while maintaining his employment and academic commitments. Detective Chun's report documented extensive conversations with Marcus after his arrest, revealing not a hardened criminal, but a young man who had found himself overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. The resolution of the case had reflected Detective Chun's understanding of the underlying factors that had motivated the crimes. Rather than simply pursuing maximum criminal penalties, he had worked with prosecutors and social service agencies to develop a solution that addressed both the legal requirements and the family crisis that had precipitated Marcus's criminal behavior. Marcus had been required to pay restitution to the businesses he had burglarized and to perform community service, but he had also been connected with financial assistance programs for his wife's medical care and with educational grants that allowed him to complete his degree without the financial pressure that had contributed to his poor choices. Asterisk, the file included follow-up reports documenting Marcus's progress over the following year, showing his successful completion of his accounting degree and his transition to legitimate full-time employment that provided health insurance for his family. Detective Chun had maintained contact with Marcus throughout this period, providing support and encouragement as he worked to rebuild his life within legal boundaries. This case demonstrated the kind of comprehensive approach to law enforcement that was documented throughout these older files. Detective Chun had recognized that effective crime prevention required understanding and addressing the underlying social and economic factors that motivated criminal behavior, not just punishing individuals after crimes had been committed. Sarah continued deeper into the archives, pulling files from cabinets that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dim recesses of the basement. Each cabinet held hundreds of stories, each file a carefully preserved record of human complexity and the patient work of officers who had understood their role as part of a larger effort to maintain social order and community cohesion. The next file she examined dealt with a domestic violence case from 1978, a situation that had required sensitive handling and long-term intervention to protect a vulnerable family member while addressing the underlying causes of the violence. The case involved the Peterson family, where 28-year-old Linda Peterson had been subjected to increasingly frequent and severe physical abuse by her husband Robert. Officer Jane Martinez had initially responded to a neighbor's call about loud arguing and what sounded like violence coming from the Peterson household. Her first report documented her careful assessment of the situation, including separate interviews with both Linda and Robert Peterson, to understand the dynamics of their relationship and the factors that were contributing to the violent episodes. Linda Peterson had been reluctant to discuss the abuse openly, reflecting the social attitudes of the late 1970s, when domestic violence was often treated as a private, family matter rather than a serious crime requiring law enforcement intervention. Officer Martinez had spent considerable time building trust with Linda, helping her understand that she had options and that the police department was prepared to take her situation seriously. The file documented Officer Martinez's patient work with the Peterson family over several months, including multiple visits to check on Linda's safety and ongoing communication with social service agencies that could provide support for both Linda and her two young children. Rather than simply responding to crisis calls, Officer Martinez had worked proactively to help Linda develop a safety plan and to connect her with resources that could help her eventually leave the abusive relationship. Robert Peterson's violent behavior had been escalating, and Officer Martinez's reports documented her efforts to understand the factors contributing to his abusive conduct. Robert had been laid off from his job at the local steel mill several months earlier, and his inability to find comparable employment had created financial stress and damaged his sense of identity as a provider for his family. While these factors did not excuse Robert's violent behavior, Officer Martinez had recognized that addressing the abuse effectively would require understanding and addressing the underlying causes. She had worked to connect Robert with employment assistance programs and with counseling services that could help him develop nonviolent ways of dealing with stress and frustration. The case had culminated in Robert's arrest following a particularly severe assault that had left Linda with injuries requiring hospitalization. But even after the arrest, Officer Martinez had continued her involvement with the family, helping Linda obtain a restraining order and working with her to develop long-term plans for her safety and independence. The file included documentation of Linda's eventual relocation to a women's shelter in another city, where she and her children could begin to rebuild their lives without the constant threat of violence. Officer Martinez had coordinated this relocation with agencies in the destination city, ensuring that Linda would have continued support and protection after leaving the immediate jurisdiction. The case had concluded with Robert's conviction for domestic assault and his participation in a court-mandated counseling program for men who had committed domestic violence. While Officer Martinez's reports made clear that this outcome did not guarantee that Robert would not commit future acts of violence, the intervention had succeeded in protecting Linda and her children from immediate danger, while connecting all family members with resources that could help prevent future violence. This case reflected the challenges facing law enforcement officers, dealing with domestic violence in an era when legal protections and social services for victims were far less developed than they would become in later decades. Officer Martinez had worked within these constraints to provide the best possible protection for a vulnerable family, using her professional skills and personal commitment to help Linda Peterson escape from a dangerous situation. The archives contained dozens of similar cases, each one documenting the patient work of officers who understood that protecting vulnerable community members often required sustained effort and collaboration with multiple agencies and service providers. The files revealed an approach to law enforcement that was deeply embedded in community relationships and social understanding. Sarah pulled another file, this one dealing with a series of thefts from parked cars that had occurred in the residential neighborhoods surrounding Central University during the spring of 1978. The investigating officer, Detective Michael Rodriguez, had approached the case by analyzing the pattern of thefts to understand the factors that were making certain vehicles and certain areas more attractive targets for thieves. Detective Rodriguez's analysis had revealed that the thefts were occurring primarily in areas where students lived off campus, targeting vehicles that contained items of particular interest to college-age individuals. Rather than taking valuable electronics or cash, the thief was focusing on textbooks, academic materials, and personal items that would be useful to someone attending the university. This pattern had led Detective Rodriguez to focus his investigation on students who might be struggling financially and who would have detailed knowledge of which neighborhoods were most likely to contain vehicles with the types of items being stolen. Rather than conducting a broad investigation of all possible suspects, he had worked with university administrators to identify students who were experiencing financial difficulties severe enough to motivate theft. The case had been solved when Detective Rodriguez identified Jennifer Walsh, a junior majoring in education who had been unable to afford required textbooks for several of her courses. Jennifer had been stealing academic materials not to sell for money, but to use in her own studies, taking items from vehicles parked in areas where other students lived and were likely to have similar academic needs. Detective Rodriguez's investigation had revealed that Jennifer's situation was not uncommon among university students who were struggling to balance academic requirements with financial limitations. The cost of textbooks and academic materials had increased significantly over the past several years, creating genuine hardship for students from lower-income families. Rather than simply arresting Jennifer and treating her case as a straightforward theft prosecution, Detective Rodriguez had worked with university officials to understand the broader problem of textbook affordability and to develop solutions that could prevent similar incidents in the future. The resolution of Jennifer's case had included restitution for the stolen items and community service requirements. But it had also led to the development of a university textbook lending program that provided temporary access to required academic materials for students who could not afford to purchase them. Detective Rodriguez's final report noted that the textbook lending program had been successful in addressing the underlying problem that had motivated Jennifer's thefts, and that there had been no similar incidents in the university area following the implementation of the program. This case exemplified the proactive approach to crime prevention that was documented throughout these older files. Detective Rodriguez had recognized that effective law enforcement required addressing the social and economic factors that motivated criminal behavior, not just punishing individuals after crimes had been committed. The basement archives seemed to extend endlessly into the darkness, each corridor revealing new rows of filing cabinets that held thousands of similar stories. Sarah found herself drawn deeper into these forgotten sections, fascinated by the window they provided into the patient, thoughtful police work of an earlier era. Each file was a testament to the dedication of officers who had understood their role as something more than simple law enforcement. They had seen themselves as guardians of community welfare, working to understand and address the complex social factors that created opportunities for crime and motivated individuals to make poor choices. The documentation itself reflected this comprehensive approach to police work. Each report was carefully written, with attention not just to the immediate facts of individual cases, but to their broader context and implications. Officers were clearly expected to think critically about their work and to document not just what they had done, but why they had chosen particular approaches and what they had learned from their experiences. As the night deepened around her, Sarah continued her exploration of these forgotten archives, knowing that each file contained important lessons about effective police work and community engagement. The stories preserved in these dusty cabinets would continue to provide guidance and inspiration for future officers, demonstrating that the most effective law enforcement was often the most patient, thoughtful, and compassionate. The quiet of the basement archives provided the perfect environment for this kind of reflective study. With no immediate demands or distractions, Sarah could give each file the careful attention it deserved, absorbing not just the specific details, but the broader patterns and principles that they illustrated. These forgotten corners of the archives held treasures of institutional wisdom, carefully preserved examples of police work at its most thoughtful and effective. Each file was a small lesson in the art of understanding human nature and working within complex social systems to maintain order and protect vulnerable community members. The dust that had settled on these older files seemed to add to their dignity rather than diminishing their importance. These cases had been concluded decades ago, their immediate urgency long since resolved, but their value as examples of thoughtful police work remained undiminished by the passage of time. In the deepest sections of the archives, where the oldest files rested in their quiet dignity, Sarah found herself surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations of dedicated police officers. Each file was a testament to their commitment to serving their communities with patience, understanding, and genuine care for the welfare of all citizens. The old courthouse on 5th Street had been built in 1952. Its Art Deco facade, rising 4 stories above the sidewalk with the kind of substantial dignity that public buildings of that era were meant to convey. At 3 in the morning, the building stood in complete silence, its windows dark except for the security lights that cast long rectangles of pale illumination across the marble floors of the lobby. Detective Captain Robert Martinez had the keys to this building, a privilege that came with his supervisory role in major case investigations. He found himself here during these quiet hours more often than he cared to admit, drawn by something about the peaceful atmosphere that descended on the courthouse when all the day's business had concluded and the building settled into its nighttime rest. The lobby stretched across the full width of the building's ground floor, its ceiling reaching up 2 stories to accommodate the grand staircase that curved gracefully toward the upper floors. The marble had been quarried in Vermont and installed by craftsmen who had understood that this building would serve the community for generations, that its materials and workmanship should reflect the permanent importance of the legal processes that would unfold within its walls. Captain Martinez's footsteps echoed softly as he crossed the lobby toward the elevator, the sound creating a gentle rhythm that seemed to match the building's quiet breathing. The elevator was one of the original installations, with brass fittings that had been polished by thousands of hands over the decades and a mechanical smoothness that spoke of careful maintenance and respect for the building's heritage. The second floor housed the municipal courtrooms where most minor criminal cases were processed, along with the offices of court clerks, probation officers, and public defenders. During business hours, these spaces buzzed with the constant activity of legal proceedings, but now they rested in complete stillness, their heavy wooden doors closed and their interiors illuminated only by the emergency lighting that provided security coverage throughout the night. Courtroom 2A had been the scene of thousands of arraignments, plea hearings, and sentencing procedures over the past 30 years. Captain Martinez had testified in this room countless times, presenting evidence and answering questions about investigations that had led to arrests and prosecutions. The room was not large by modern standards, with seating for perhaps 50 people in the gallery, but it had been designed with careful attention to the dignity and solemnity that legal proceedings required. The judge's bench dominated the front of the room, elevated several feet above the floor level and crafted from dark oak that had aged to a rich patina over the decades. Behind the bench, the wall displayed the seal of the state and an American flag, symbols that reminded everyone present that the proceedings conducted in this room were part of a larger system of democratic governance and constitutional protection. Witness stand stood to the right of the judge's bench, a simple but substantial chair, surrounded by a low wooden barrier that defined the space where testimony was given under oath. Captain Martinez had occupied that chair many times, always feeling the weight of responsibility that came with providing accurate, truthful testimony that might determine the outcome of someone's case. The prosecution and defense tables faced the judge's bench, positioned to allow attorneys to address the court. while maintaining visual contact with their clients and the evidence being presented. These tables had heard thousands of legal arguments over the years, had supported countless case files and legal briefs, had witnessed the careful process by which accusations were tested against evidence and legal standards. The jury box, when this courtroom was used for jury trials, could accommodate 12 citizens plus alternates, all seated in chairs that had been designed for comfort during long proceedings, but also arranged to ensure clear sight lines to all participants in the trial. The jury box represented one of the fundamental principles of the American legal system. The idea that ordinary citizens could be trusted to weigh evidence carefully and render fair verdicts based on law and facts rather than passion or prejudice. Captain Martinez found himself thinking about the hundreds of cases that had been resolved in this room. The careful process by which conflicts were transformed into legal proceedings and then resolved through the application of established law and procedure. The room had witnessed moments of high drama, certainly, but more often it had been the scene of quiet, methodical work as attorneys, judges, and court staff had worked together to ensure that justice was administered fairly and consistently. The holding cells in the basement of the courthouse told a different part of the story, representing the temporary detention of individuals who were awaiting court appearances or transport to other facilities. These cells were not designed for long-term imprisonment, but rather as secure, humane spaces where people could wait safely while legal proceedings determined their fate. The basement holding area contained 6 individual cells, each one approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls painted in a neutral beige color that was meant to be calming rather than intimidating. Each cell contained a bench that could serve as seating during the day, or a bed for anyone who needed to rest while awaiting court appearances, along with basic sanitary facilities and a small sink with running water. The holding area was monitored continuously by security cameras and staffed by trained corrections officers who understood that their role was to ensure safety and security while treating all detainees with dignity and respect. The officers who worked in this area during regular business hours had developed relationships with many of the individuals who appeared regularly in municipal court, understanding that many of the people they supervised were struggling with addiction, mental illness, homelessness, or other challenges that contributed to their involvement with the legal system. During the night hours, the holding cells were usually empty, their heavy steel doors standing open to allow air circulation and regular cleaning. The silence in this area was different from the peaceful quiet of the courtrooms upstairs. Here, the stillness felt expectant, as if the space was simply waiting for the next day's activities to begin. Captain Martinez walked slowly through the holding area, his footsteps echoing differently in the concrete-walled space. He thought about the individuals who had spent time in these cells over the years, most of them facing relatively minor charges, but all of them caught up in circumstances that had brought them into contact with the criminal justice system. The processing area adjacent to the holding cells contained the administrative infrastructure necessary for handling arrestees efficiently and accurately. Booking stations included fingerprinting equipment, photography setup for mugshots, and computer terminals for accessing criminal history databases and entering information about new arrests. This area operated with the kind of systematic efficiency that was necessary when dealing with large numbers of people who needed to be processed through the legal system quickly but thoroughly. Every arrest generated paperwork that needed to be completed accurately. Every individual needed to be photographed and fingerprinted for identification purposes. And every case needed to be entered into the court scheduling system to ensure timely appearances before judges. The efficiency of this process was essential, not just for administrative reasons, but for constitutional ones as well. Individuals who were arrested had the right to prompt appearances before judges who could determine whether there was sufficient evidence to justify continued detention and whether bail or other release conditions were appropriate. The processing area's systematic approach ensured that these constitutional requirements were met consistently and professionally. During busy periods, the processing area might handle dozens of arrests in a single shift, with officers working steadily to ensure that everyone was processed promptly and accurately. The work required attention to detail and patience, as even small errors in paperwork could create delays or complications that might affect the outcome of someone's case. The third floor of the courthouse housed the felony courtrooms where more serious cases were tried, along with the offices of senior judges and the court administrator. These courtrooms were larger and more formal than the municipal courts on the second floor, designed to accommodate the more complex proceedings that serious criminal cases required. Courtroom 3B had been the site of some of the most significant criminal trials in the county's recent history, including several murder cases and major fraud prosecutions that had captured public attention. Captain Martinez had testified in many of these cases, often spending hours on the witness stand explaining complex investigations and answering detailed questions about evidence collection and analysis. The atmosphere in this courtroom was more solemn than in the municipal courts, reflecting the seriousness of the charges being adjudicated and the potential consequences for defendants. The gallery could accommodate over 100 spectators, and during high-profile trials, these seats were often filled with family members, media representatives, and members of the public who were following the proceedings. The jury selection process for felony trials took place in this courtroom as well, with potential jurors questioned extensively about their backgrounds, attitudes, and ability to render fair verdicts based solely on evidence presented during the trial. This process, known as voir dire, was essential for ensuring that defendants received fair trials from impartial juries, but it also represented a significant investment of time and resources that reflected the importance placed on getting these serious cases right. The evidence presentation areas in this courtroom were more elaborate than those in the municipal courts, with projection equipment for displaying documents and photographs, tables for physical evidence, and technological infrastructure for playing audio and video recordings. These capabilities were necessary for complex cases that might involve extensive documentation, forensic evidence, and witness testimony from multiple sources. Captain Martinez had observed hundreds of trials from the witness stand in the gallery, watching as attorneys carefully constructed their arguments and juries wrestled with difficult questions about guilt, innocence, and the proper application of legal standards to complex factual situations. The process was often slow and sometimes repetitive, but this deliberate pace was intentional, designed to ensure that all relevant evidence was presented and that all parties had adequate opportunity to make their cases. The appeals courtroom on the fourth floor represented the final stage of the local judicial process, where convicted defendants could seek review of their cases if they believed that legal errors had affected the outcome of their trials. This courtroom was smaller and more academic in atmosphere, focused on legal arguments rather than factual disputes. Appeals proceedings were conducted primarily through written briefs and oral arguments, with attorneys focusing on questions of law rather than questions of fact. The judges who heard appeals cases were concerned not with determining what had actually happened in particular incidents, but with whether lower courts had applied legal standards correctly and whether defendants had received the fair trials that the Constitution guaranteed. Captain Martinez had been involved in relatively few appeals cases, as his role was primarily focused on investigation and evidence presentation rather than legal interpretation. However, He understood that the appeals process was an essential component of the criminal justice system, providing a safeguard against errors and ensuring that convictions were based on properly obtained evidence and correctly applied legal standards. The administrative offices throughout the courthouse supported all of these judicial functions, providing the clerical, technological, and logistical infrastructure that allowed the legal system to operate efficiently and effectively. Court clerks maintained the official records of all proceedings, scheduled hearings and trials, and ensured that all required documents were properly filed and preserved. The probation department offices were located on the second floor, adjacent to the municipal courtrooms where many of their clients made regular appearances. Probation officers worked with individuals who had been convicted of crimes but were serving their sentences in the community rather than in jail or prison, helping them comply with court-ordered conditions and providing support for rehabilitation efforts. The work of probation officers represented a different approach to criminal justice, one focused on rehabilitation and community safety rather than purely punitive measures. Officers in this department often developed long-term relationships with their clients, working with them through multiple challenges and setbacks as they tried to rebuild their lives within legal boundaries. The public defender's office occupied a suite of rooms on the third floor, providing legal representation for defendants who could not afford to hire private attorneys. These attorneys handled enormous caseloads, often representing dozens of clients, simultaneously while working with limited resources and support staff. Despite these challenges, the public defenders who worked in this building were committed to providing effective representation for all of their clients, understanding that their work was essential for maintaining the integrity of the adversarial system that was fundamental to American criminal justice. They worked closely with investigators, social workers, and other professionals to develop comprehensive defenses that addressed not just the legal aspects of their clients' cases, but also the underlying personal and social factors that had contributed to their involvement with the criminal justice system. The building's infrastructure reflected the importance of the work that was conducted within its walls. The security systems included metal detectors at all entrances, surveillance cameras throughout the public areas, and secure transportation routes for moving detained individuals between the holding cells and the courtrooms. The technological system supported everything from case management databases to audio recording equipment that preserved complete records of all court proceedings. These systems required constant maintenance and regular upgrades to ensure that they could support the complex information management requirements of modern legal proceedings. Building's design also reflected an understanding that the administration of justice required both efficiency and dignity. The materials and architectural details were chosen to convey the seriousness and importance of legal proceedings while also creating environments that were conducive to careful deliberation and fair decision-making. As Captain Martinez completed his quiet tour of the building, he reflected on the thousands of cases that had been processed through these rooms over the decades. Each case had represented a moment when the community's commitment to the rule of law had been tested and affirmed, when conflicts had been resolved through established procedures rather than private violence or arbitrary power. The building stood as a testament to the belief that justice could be administered fairly and consistently through careful adherence to legal procedures and constitutional principles. The quiet dignity of the empty courtrooms and administrative offices reflected the serious responsibility that came with this work. The understanding that the decisions made in these rooms affected not just individual defendants, but the entire community's sense of security and fairness. The night shift security guards who maintained the building during these quiet hours understood their role as guardians of more than just physical property. They were protecting the integrity of the spaces where justice was administered, ensuring that these rooms would be ready for the next day's proceedings and that the work of the courts could continue without interruption. The peaceful atmosphere that descended on the courthouse during the night hours provided an opportunity for reflection on the importance of the work that was conducted here during business hours, away from the immediate pressures and emotions of active legal proceedings. The building's quiet dignity reminded all who entered it that the administration of justice was one of the fundamental responsibilities of democratic government, and one of the most important services that the community provided for its citizens. Maple Street in the Riverside District stretched for 8 blocks between the old elementary school and the community park, lined with modest 2-story homes that had been built in the 1950s, when the neighborhood was first developed for young families starting their lives in the post-war economy. The trees that gave the street its name had grown tall over the decades, their branches now forming a canopy that filtered the streetlight and created patterns of shadow and illumination that changed with the seasons. At number 247, the Morrison household had settled into its evening routine with the kind of peaceful predictability that had returned only gradually after the events of 18 months ago. The porch light cast a warm circle on the front steps where Mr. Morrison had placed a small bench, painted white to match the house's trim, where he sometimes sat with his coffee in the early morning hours before leaving for work at the municipal water department. Inside, the house carried the accumulated comfort of a family that had learned to appreciate the ordinary pleasures of daily life. Mrs. Morrison moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing tomorrow's school lunches for their 2 children, with the methodical care that she brought to all domestic tasks. The kitchen window looked out onto the backyard, where a vegetable garden flourished under her patient attention. Rows of tomatoes and peppers that would soon be ready for the late summer harvest. The events that had disrupted this peaceful routine had begun on a Tuesday evening in March of the previous year, when their teenage son, David, had become involved with a group of older boys whose interest in petty theft and vandalism had gradually escalated into more serious criminal activity. The family had first become aware of the problem when David failed to come home from school at his usual time, arriving instead near midnight with torn clothing and an explanation that satisfied no one. Detective Linda Chun had been assigned to investigate a series of break-ins in the Nika neighborhood, and her patient detective work had eventually led to David Morrison and his companions. But Detective Chun's approach to the Cones case had reflected an understanding that teenage criminal behavior was often symptomatic of larger problems that required comprehensive solutions rather than simple punishment. Morrison family's crisis had deepened when David was arrested for his participation in a burglary at the Henderson house 3 blocks away. The arrest had been handled with care, with Detective Chun ensuring that David was treated with dignity while also helping his parents understand the seriousness of the charges he was facing and the potential consequences if the pattern of behavior continued. But the resolution of David's case had involved much more than the legal proceedings that determined his punishment. Detective Chun had worked with the Morrison family over several months, helping them understand the factors that had contributed to David's poor choices and develop strategies for preventing future problems. The family had discovered that David's involvement with the older boys had begun as a response to social isolation at school, where he had been struggling academically and felt disconnected from his classmates. The criminal activity had provided him with a sense of belonging and excitement that he had been unable to find through legitimate activities, working with school counselors and community youth programs. The Morrison family had developed a comprehensive plan for addressing David's needs while also ensuring that he understood the consequences of his actions. David had been required to make restitution to the families whose homes had been burglarized, perform community service in the neighborhood, and participate in counseling that helped him develop better decision-making skills and social connections. But perhaps most importantly, the family had worked together to strengthen their communication and to create opportunities for David to find the sense of purpose and belonging that he had been seeking through criminal activity. Mr. Morrison had begun including David in his weekend home improvement projects, teaching him practical skills while also providing opportunities for conversation and relationship building. Mrs. Morrison had encouraged David's interest in gardening, helping him establish his own section of the family's backyard garden where he could take responsibility for growing vegetables that the family would use throughout the summer. This project had given David a sense of accomplishment and ownership, while also connecting him to the kind of productive, legal activity that could provide long-term satisfaction. The community's response to David's situation had been characterized by the kind of supportive approach that made healing and growth possible. Rather than treating the Morrison family as pariahs whose son had brought shame to the neighborhood, neighbors had offered understanding and practical assistance as the family worked through their crisis. Mrs. Henderson, whose house David had helped burglarize, had shown particular grace in her response to the situation. Rather than demanding maximum punishment, she had worked with Detective Chun and the Morrison family to develop a restorative justice approach that emphasized accountability and learning rather than purely punitive measures. David had spent several weekends helping Mrs. Henderson with yard work and home maintenance tasks, providing practical assistance while also giving both of them opportunities to have conversations about the impact of crime on victims and the importance of making choices that contributed to community welfare rather than disrupting it. These conversations had helped David understand that his actions had affected real people in significant ways, that the burglary had made Mrs. Henderson feel unsafe in her own home and had forced her to spend money on security measures that she could not easily afford. But they had also helped him understand that Mrs. Henderson was willing to forgive him and to support his efforts to make better choices in the future. The transformation in David's behavior had been gradual but steady. His academic performance had improved as he developed better study habits and began participating in school activities that provided positive social connections. His relationship with his parents had strengthened as they worked together on projects and activities that built trust and communication. Most significantly, David had become involved in a youth mentoring program where he worked with younger children who were at risk of making some of the same poor choices that had gotten him into trouble. This experience had given him a sense of purpose and responsibility while also helping him understand how his own experiences could be used to help others avoid similar problems. The Morrison family story had become one of the neighborhood's quiet success stories, an example of how families and communities could work together to address problems constructively rather than simply punishing individuals after damage had been done. Their experience had contributed to broader conversations about youth crime prevention and community-based alternatives to traditional criminal justice approaches. 3 houses down from the Morrisons, the Chun family had faced their own challenges several years earlier when Mrs. Chun's elderly mother had become the victim of a telephone fraud scheme that had cost her nearly all of her savings. The crime had been particularly devastating because Mrs. Chun's mother had been proud of her financial independence and had been saving the money to help pay for her granddaughter's college education. The fraud had been sophisticated, with the criminals posing as representatives of her bank and convincing her that her account had been compromised and that she needed to transfer her money to a temporary account for protection. The scheme had played on her fears about financial security while also exploiting her trust in official-sounding authorities. Detective Robert Martinez had investigated the case with the kind of patience and thoroughness that complex fraud cases required. The criminals had used technology and psychological manipulation techniques that made them difficult to identify and prosecute, and Mrs. Chun's mother had been embarrassed by her victimization and reluctant to provide the detailed information that the investigation required. Detective Martinez had worked with the Chun family to understand not just the mechanics of the fraud, but also the emotional and psychological impact it had had on Mrs. Chun's mother. The crime had shaken her confidence in her ability to manage her own affairs and had created fears about her financial security that affected her daily life and well-being. The investigation had eventually led to the identification of a criminal organization that had been targeting elderly residents throughout the region with similar fraud schemes. But the prosecution of the criminals had taken months, and the recovery of Mrs. Chun's mother's money had been only partial, creating ongoing financial stress for the family. The Chun family's response to their crisis had emphasized both practical problem-solving and emotional healing. Mrs. Chun had worked with financial advisors and elder care specialists to develop systems that would protect her mother from future fraud attempts, while also preserving her autonomy and dignity. The family had also worked with community organizations to educate other elderly residents about fraud prevention, turning their painful experience into an opportunity to help others avoid similar victimization. Mrs. Chun's mother had initially been reluctant to speak publicly about her experience, but she had eventually become an effective advocate for fraud prevention education. The neighborhood support for the Chun family during their crisis had been characteristic of the kind of community solidarity that made recovery and healing possible. Neighbors had offered practical assistance with errands and transportation, while Mrs. Chun's mother regained her confidence, and they had participated in community education programs about fraud prevention. The experience had strengthened relationships throughout the neighborhood as residents had worked together to protect vulnerable community members, while also learning about the sophisticated techniques that criminals were using to exploit elderly people. The Chun family's willingness to share their experience had helped create a more informed and vigilant community that was better equipped to prevent future crimes. On Oak Avenue, just 2 blocks east of Maple Street, the Rodriguez family had dealt with a different kind of crisis when their teenage daughter Maria had become involved in a relationship with an older man who had been engaging in drug dealing and other criminal activities. The situation had been complicated by Maria's reluctance to discuss her relationship with her parents and by the criminal's efforts to isolate her from her family and friends. Officer Jennifer Wong had become involved with the Rodriguez family situation through her work with the department's youth outreach program, which focused on preventing young people from becoming victims of exploitation and manipulation. Officer Wong's approach had emphasized building trust with Maria, while also helping her parents understand the dynamics of exploitative relationships and develop strategies for protecting their daughter. The case had required careful coordination between law enforcement, social services, and family counseling resources to address both the criminal aspects of the situation and the family dynamics that had made Maria vulnerable to exploitation. Officer Wong had worked patiently to help Maria understand that her boyfriend's interest in her was not romantic love, but rather a calculated effort to use her for his criminal activities. The resolution of Maria's situation had involved her gradual recognition of the manipulative and dangerous nature of her relationship, supported by counseling and family therapy that helped her develop healthier ways of thinking about relationships and personal worth. The criminal had eventually been arrested and prosecuted for drug dealing, but the more important outcome had been Maria's successful extraction from the relationship and her reconnection with her family. The Rodriguez family's experience had highlighted the importance of education and communication and preventing young people from becoming victims of criminal exploitation. Maria's parents had learned to recognize warning signs of manipulative relationships and had developed better communication patterns that made it easier for Maria to seek help when she encountered difficult situations. The neighborhood's response to the Rodriguez family's crisis had been supportive but discreet, respecting the family's privacy while also offering assistance when it was needed. Community members had participated in educational programs about youth exploitation and had worked together to create environments where young people felt safe seeking help from trusted adults. These stories of individual families dealing with crime and its aftermath had become part of the neighborhood's collective memory. Examples of how communities could support their members through difficult times while also working together to prevent future problems. The quiet strength that characterized these residential streets came not from the absence of problems, but from the community's ability to respond to problems constructively. The evening routines that played out behind the glowing windows of these homes reflected families that had learned to appreciate the ordinary pleasures of daily life while also maintaining vigilance about the factors that could disrupt community safety and welfare. Children did homework at kitchen tables while parents prepared dinner, conversations flowing around the comfortable familiarity of shared spaces and shared experiences. The front porches and small yards that defined the neighborhood's character provided opportunities for informal social interaction that strengthened community bonds and created natural surveillance systems that contributed to safety and security. Neighbors knew each other's routines and were quick to notice when something seemed unusual or concerning. The community organizations that served the neighborhood had been strengthened by their responses to individual crises, developing programs and services that addressed both immediate needs and long-term prevention goals. The parent-teacher organization at the local elementary school had expanded its focus to include safety education and family support services. The Neighborhood Watch program had evolved beyond simple crime prevention to encompass broader community-building activities that brought residents together around shared interests and concerns. Block parties and community garden projects had created opportunities for neighbors to develop relationships that made mutual support and assistance more natural and effective. The local businesses that served the neighborhood had also become part of the informal safety and support network, with shop owners and service providers who knew their customers personally and were alert to signs that someone might need assistance or protection. The tree-lined streets that created the neighborhood's peaceful atmosphere had been preserved and enhanced through community efforts that recognized the importance of environmental factors in creating safe, pleasant living conditions. Street lighting had been improved to enhance safety while preserving the residential character that residents valued. As night settled over these quiet streets, the soft glow from windows and porch lights created a landscape of security and contentment that reflected the patient work of families and communities that had faced challenges and emerged stronger. The peaceful rhythm of evening activities behind those glowing windows told stories of resilience, healing, and the quiet determination that allowed ordinary people to rebuild their lives after being touched by crime. The neighborhood's transformation from a collection of individual households into a genuine community had been gradual, built through shared experiences and mutual support during times of crisis. The families who lived on these streets had learned that safety and security came not just from law enforcement and security systems, but from the relationships and social connections that made neighbors willing to watch out for each other and work together to address problems before they became crises. The children who played in these yards and walked to school along these sidewalks were growing up in an environment that emphasized both personal responsibility and community support, learning through daily experience that their choices affected not just themselves, but their neighbors and friends. The lessons they absorbed from watching their parents navigate difficult situations and work together to solve problems would shape their own approaches to citizenship and community participation. The quiet strength of these neighborhoods represented one of the most important, but least visible aspects of crime prevention and community safety. The social fabric that connected these families and made mutual support possible was built through thousands of small interactions and shared experiences, creating resilience that could withstand the inevitable challenges and disruptions that were part of community life. As the night deepened and the last lights in bedroom windows were extinguished, these streets settled into the peaceful quiet that came from the security of knowing that neighbors were watching over each other, and that the community's shared commitment to safety and mutual support would continue through the dark hours and into the next day's activities and challenges. Third-floor corridor of the central precinct stretched in both directions from the elevator, its polished linoleum reflecting the subdued lighting that marked the transition from day operations to night watch. Sergeant Patricia Williams had walked this hallway countless times over her 12 years with the department, but there was something different about the late evening hours when the building settled into its quieter rhythms and the work took on a more reflective quality. Her office, number 312, overlooked the parking lot and the small park beyond, where a few late dog walkers moved slowly under the streetlights and the occasional patrol car made its routine circuit through the neighborhood. The window was open, just enough to let in the cool night air, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city settling into its own version of rest, the gentle hum of traffic on the main thoroughfares, the occasional siren growing fainter as it moved toward its destination, the barely audible whisper of wind through the oak trees that lined the streets surrounding this precinct. The night shift at Central Precinct consisted of 8 officers, 2 detectives, 1 desk sergeant, and a lieutenant who supervised operations until the day watch returned at 7 in the morning. This skeleton crew was responsible for covering the same geographic area and population that required 23 personnel during peak hours. But the nature of their work was fundamentally different from the rapid response and immediate crisis management that characterized day shift operations. Sergeant Williams' primary responsibility during these hours was report review and case file management, the patient work of ensuring that all documentation from the day's activities was complete, accurate, and properly filed for future reference. The stack of files on her desk represented 8 hours of police work distilled into the careful language of official reports, each one a small exercise in transforming the chaos of human conflict into the ordered structure that the criminal justice system required. The first file she reviewed contained Officer Rodriguez's report of a domestic disturbance call that had been resolved without arrest through what he described as family mediation and resource referral. The call had come from neighbors who were concerned about loud arguing from the apartment next door. But Officer Rodriguez's investigation had revealed a family struggling with unemployment, housing insecurity, and the stress of caring for an elderly relative with dementia. Rather than simply documenting a noise complaint, Officer Rodriguez had spent nearly 2 hours with the family, helping them contact social services for assistance with elder care resources and connecting them with employment counseling services that might help address their financial difficulties. His report reflected the kind of comprehensive problem-solving that characterized the department's community policing approach, treating individual incidents as opportunities to address underlying social issues rather than simply enforcing immediate compliance with noise ordinances. Sergeant Williams made notes in the file margins, documenting her review and flagging the case for follow-up contact to ensure that the family had successfully connected with the resources Officer Rodriguez had recommended. This kind of proactive case management was one of the responsibilities that made night shift work particularly valuable, providing time for the careful attention to detail, That often wasn't possible during the more hectic pace of day. Operations. The second file dealt with a shoplifting incident at Morrison's grocery that had been resolved through what Detective Chun described as educational intervention rather than criminal prosecution. The suspect was a 16-year-old girl who had been taking food items, apparently to supplement inadequate nutrition at home, rather than for any commercial purpose or thrill-seeking behavior. Detective Chun's report documented his investigation into the girl's family situation, revealing that her mother was working 2 part-time jobs while attending community college classes and that the family was struggling to afford adequate groceries despite their best efforts to manage their limited income. Rather than processing the girl through the juvenile justice system, Detective Chun had worked with the store manager and social services to address the underlying food insecurity, while also ensuring that the girl understood the legal and ethical problems with her behavior. The resolution had involved connecting the family with food assistance programs, arranging for the girl to perform community service at a local food bank where she could learn about legitimate ways to address hunger and food insecurity, and establishing a mentoring relationship with a school counselor who could provide ongoing support and guidance. Sergeant Williams reviewed Detective Chun's documentation carefully, noting the thoroughness of his investigation and the creativity of the solution he had developed. This case exemplified the kind of problem-solving that the department encouraged in situations where traditional law enforcement responses might actually make underlying problems worse rather than addressing them constructively. Desk Sergeant's position during night shift was occupied by Sergeant Michael Thompson, a 20-year veteran who had developed a particular expertise in managing the complex logistics of overnight operations. His responsibilities included coordinating with patrol units, managing communications with other law enforcement agencies, and handling the various administrative tasks that kept the precinct functioning smoothly during the hours when most administrative staff were off duty. Sergeant Thompson's desk was positioned in the reception area where he could monitor both radio communications and foot traffic, though the latter was minimal during these late hours. The reception area was designed with both security and accessibility in mind, allowing easy access for community members who needed police services, while also maintaining appropriate protection for officers and staff. The radio communications that flowed through Sergeant Thompson's position provided a constant background narrative of the city's nighttime activities. Patrol units reported their locations and activities in the abbreviated language that police officers used to maintain efficient communication. But each transmission represented a moment when officers were engaged with community members, responding to calls for assistance, or conducting the routine patrols that maintained visible police presence throughout the city. Most of these communications dealt with relatively minor incidents, traffic stops, welfare checks, noise complaints, and the various small disruptions that occurred when people gathered in public spaces during evening hours. But each call required careful attention from patrol officers who understood that minor incidents could sometimes escalate into serious problems if they weren't handled appropriately. The patrol units working night shift covered larger geographic areas than their day shift counterparts, reflecting the reduced call volume and different patterns of criminal activity that characterized overnight hours. Officers David Martinez and Lisa Wong were responsible for the downtown area, including the business district that was largely empty during these hours but required regular security checks to prevent vandalism and burglary. Their patrol pattern took them through the narrow streets of the historic district, where small shops and restaurants had closed hours earlier, leaving behind the quiet atmosphere of a commercial area at rest. The streetlights illuminated empty sidewalks and the darkened windows of businesses whose owners had gone home to their families, trusting that police patrols would protect their properties, until morning brought customers and activity back to the area. Officers Martinez and Wong had developed a routine that combined systematic coverage of their assigned area with flexible response to the various situations that arose during their shift. They alternated between vehicle patrols that allowed them to cover large areas quickly and walking beats that provided closer contact with community members and better observation of conditions that might require attention. Walking portions of their patrol brought them into contact with the city's overnight population security guards, late shift workers, hospital staff traveling between shifts, and the various individuals who found themselves on the streets during these quiet hours for both legitimate and problematic reasons. These interactions provided opportunities for community policing that were different from the more crisis-oriented contacts that characterized day shift work. The residential patrol areas were covered by officers Jennifer Park and Robert Kim, who were responsible for the neighborhoods where most of the city's families lived in the modest homes and apartment complexes that housed teachers, retail workers, municipal employees, and retirees. These areas were generally quiet during overnight hours, but they required the kind of attentive patrol work that ensured residents felt secure in their homes, and that potential problems were identified before they could develop into serious incidents. Officers Park and Kim had learned to recognize the normal patterns of their neighborhoods, which houses typically had lights on late into the evening, which residents worked unusual hours and might be seen coming and going at times that would be concerning in other contexts, which areas were popular for late evening dog walking and exercise activities. This detailed knowledge of their patrol areas allowed them to identify situations that deviated from normal patterns and might require investigation or assistance. The detective work that continued during night shift was primarily focused on case review and report writing rather than active investigation. Though detectives were on call for serious incidents that required immediate specialized attention, Detective Sarah Chun used these quiet hours to review case files, conduct research using law enforcement databases, and prepare reports that would guide day shift investigations. Detective Chun's current caseload included several burglary investigations that required careful analysis of crime patterns and coordination with other jurisdictions where similar incidents had occurred. The night shift provided ideal conditions for this kind of detailed analytical work, allowing her to focus on complex patterns and relationships without the interruptions that characterized day shift operations. Her desk was equipped with computer terminals that provided access to multiple law enforcement databases, allowing her to research criminal histories, identify potential connections between different cases, and coordinate with investigators and other agencies. This technological infrastructure supported the kind of comprehensive investigation that modern police work required, while also maintaining the security and confidentiality that sensitive criminal justice information demanded. The evidence processing and storage areas that supported detective work were located in the basement of the precinct, where controlled environmental conditions and security systems protected the physical evidence that might be crucial for successful prosecutions. Night shift personnel included an evidence technician who maintained these systems and processed any evidence that was collected during overnight operations. The evidence storage area was organized with the same systematic precision that characterized all aspects of police work, with each item cataloged, photographed, and stored according to strict protocols that ensured its integrity and availability for court proceedings. The work required meticulous attention to detail and thorough understanding of legal requirements for evidence handling. as procedural errors could compromise entire cases, regardless of the quality of the investigation. The Juvenile Services Coordinator, who worked night shift, was Officer Amanda Rodriguez, who specialized in cases involving minors and coordinated with social services, schools, and family courts to ensure that young people who came into contact with the police system received appropriate services and support. Her work during these hours often involved case review and preparation rather than direct service delivery. But she was available for consultation when patrol officers encountered situations involving children or teenagers. Officer Rodriguez's office was equipped with specialized resources for working with young people, including information about educational programs, counseling services, mentoring opportunities, and other community resources that could help address the underlying factors that sometimes led to juvenile involvement with the criminal justice system. Her expertise was particularly valuable in developing prevention and intervention strategies that could help young people avoid future legal problems. The community relations work that was an essential component of modern policing continued during night shift through the various informal contacts that officers had with community members during their patrols and responses to calls for service. These interactions provided opportunities to build the trust and communication that made community policing effective while also gathering information about community concerns and priorities. The night shift commanders recognized that their officers had unique opportunities to observe community conditions and interact with residents under circumstances that were often less stressful and more conducive to genuine communication than the crisis situations that typically brought police into contact with community members during day hours. Lieutenant James Foster supervised night shift operations from his office on the second floor, where he could monitor radio communications, review reports, and coordinate with other shifts and agencies as needed. His responsibilities included ensuring that all night shift personnel had the support and resources they needed to perform their duties effectively while also maintaining the standards of professionalism and community service that the department expected. Lieutenant Foster's approach to night shift supervision emphasized the unique opportunities that these hours provided for professional development, case review, and community relationship building. He encouraged his officers to use the quieter pace of night operations to develop their skills in report writing, case analysis, and problem solving, while also maintaining the vigilance and responsiveness that effective police work required. The administrative support functions that kept the precinct operating smoothly continued during night shift through the work of a small clerical staff who processed reports, maintained records, and handled the various communication and coordination tasks that supported field operations. This behind-the-scenes work was essential for ensuring that day shift personnel would have access to current information and properly process documentation when they arrived in the morning. The communications center that coordinated emergency responses and maintained contact with patrol units was staffed around the clock, with specially trained dispatchers who understood the unique challenges and opportunities of night shift operations. These professionals served as the crucial link between community members seeking police assistance and the officers who provided that assistance, ensuring that calls for service were routed appropriately and that officers had the information they needed to respond effectively. As the night progressed toward the early morning hours, the pace of activity typically decreased further, providing even more opportunities for the reflective, analytical work that characterized quality police operations. The building itself seemed to settle into deeper quiet, its corridors and offices taking on the peaceful atmosphere of a workplace at rest, while still maintaining the readiness to respond immediately to any situation that might require police attention. The parking lot outside gradually emptied as off-duty personnel departed for their homes, leaving behind the vehicles of night shift staff and the patrol cars that would carry officers through their routes. until dawn brought the change of shifts and the beginning of another day's activities. The precinct's windows glowed softly in the darkness, beacons of the continuous service that connected law enforcement to the community. It served through all hours and all circumstances. The clock on Lieutenant Foster's office wall moved slowly toward morning, marking the steady passage of hours that allowed for thorough, thoughtful police work while the city rested. In a few hours, the building would come alive again with the energy and urgency of day shift operations. But for now, the night watch maintained its quiet vigil, ensuring that the community's safety and security continued uninterrupted. Through the peaceful hours of darkness, the evidence room in the basement of the central precinct had been renovated 3 times since the theme situate building's construction in 1962. Each renovation expanding the storage capacity and improving the environmental controls that protected the thousands of photographs, documents, and physical items that constituted the department's historical record. Detective Lieutenant Margaret O'Brien had been the custodian of this space for 8 years, and she understood better than anyone the stories that rested in its climate-controlled silence. The photograph collection occupied an entire wall of the evidence room, filing cabinets stretching from floor to ceiling and containing hundreds of thousands of images that documented 4 decades of police work. Each photograph had been carefully cataloged and preserved according to strict archival standards, ensuring that these visual records would remain available for future reference long after the cases they documented had been closed and filed away. Lieutenant O'Brien moved slowly through the photograph section, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished concrete floor. The overhead lighting was designed to provide adequate illumination for research work while protecting the photographs from the kind of exposure that could cause fading or deterioration over time. The air circulation system maintained precise temperature and humidity levels, creating an environment that felt almost sacred in its dedication to preservation and memory. The photographs from the 1970s occupied the first bank of filing cabinets, their black and white images capturing a city that looked both familiar and foreign when compared to its current appearance. These images documented crimes that had shocked the community at the time, but had since been absorbed into the larger narrative of the city's history. Their immediate urgency transformed into historical record. Lieutenant O'Brien pulled a folder marked Case 1976 to 234 and spread its contents across the research table that occupied the center of the room. The photograph showed the aftermath of a burglary at Riverside Elementary School, where someone had broken into the principal's office and taken the small amount of cash that was kept for emergency expenses. The images captured the scattered papers, the forced filing cabinet, and the broken window that had served as the point of entry. But looking at these photographs now, more than 4 decades after they were taken, Lieutenant O'Brien saw not just evidence of a crime, but a window into a different era of education and community life. The principal's office showed the kind of personal touches that had been common in that period: family photographs on the desk, handmade decorations created by students, a coffee cup that suggested the human presence that had been disrupted by the break. The case file that accompanied the photographs told the story of the investigation that had followed, conducted by Detective William Murphy with the kind of patience and thoroughness that had characterized police work of that era. The burglary had been solved within 2 weeks when Detective Murphy identified a former student who had been struggling with unemployment and had remembered the cash that was sometimes kept in the principal's office. The resolution of the case had reflected the community-oriented approach that had guided police work in the 1970s, rather than simply arresting and prosecuting the young man. Detective Murphy had worked with school officials and social service agencies to address the underlying economic problems that had motivated the crime. The former student had been required to pay restitution and perform community service at the school, but he had also been connected with job training programs that eventually led to stable employment. Lieutenant O'Brien found herself moved by the photographs of the community service portion of the case resolution. The images showed the young man working alongside maintenance staff to repair the damage he had caused, painting over graffiti in the school hallways, and helping with landscape maintenance in the school's courtyard garden. His face in these later photographs showed a combination of determination and relief that suggested the community service had provided him with a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing from his life. The folder also contained photographs taken several years later, when the former student had returned to the school as a volunteer coach for the youth basketball program. Detective Murphy had maintained contact with him throughout his transformation, documenting not just the immediate resolution of the crime, but the longer-term success of the rehabilitative approach that had been taken. These follow-up photographs showed the young man working with elementary school children, teaching them basketball skills and serving as a positive role model for students who might be facing some of the same economic and social challenges that had led to his own poor choices. The images captured moments of genuine joy and connection, transforming what had begun as a story of crime and victimization into one of redemption and community service. Lieutenant O'Brien moved on to another section of the photograph collection, pulling folders that documented cases from the early 1980s. The technology for crime scene photography had improved by this period, with color film becoming more common and lighting techniques that provided clearer, more detailed images of evidence and crime scenes. Case 1983156 involved a series of vandalism incidents at the downtown business district, where someone had been spray painting elaborate murals on the sides of buildings during late-night hours. The photographs captured the artwork in vivid detail, showing designs that incorporated political messages, abstract imagery, and decorative elements that suggested considerable artistic skill and planning. The investigating officer, Sergeant Lisa Chun, had approached the case not as simple property destruction, but as an opportunity to understand the motivations behind the unauthorized artwork and to find constructive ways to channel them artist's obvious talent and passion. Her investigation had focused on identifying art supply purchases, analyzing the techniques and materials used in the murals, and connecting with local art teachers and community leaders who might have insights into the local art scene. The photographs documented Sergeant Chun's methodical approach to understanding the artwork itself, showing close-up details of brush techniques, color combinations, and compositional elements that revealed information about the artist's training and influences. These images had been used not just as evidence of vandalism, but as clues to the identity and background of the person responsible for the unauthorized murals. The case had been solved when Sergeant Chen identified Maria Santos, a 19-year-old art student who had been using the building walls as canvases for expressing her political and social concerns. But rather than simply arresting Maria and treating the case as criminal mischief, Sergeant Chun had worked with community arts organizations to develop a solution that addressed both the legal issues and the underlying desire for artistic expression. The resolution had involved Maria working with building owners to create a series of legal murals that replaced the unauthorized artwork while preserving the artistic vision that had motivated the original vandalism. The photographs documenting this process showed Maria working with established artists and community volunteers to create public art that enhanced the downtown area while also providing an appropriate outlet for her creative energy. The transformation was documented in a series of before, during, and after photographs that showed the evolution from unauthorized vandalism to community-supported public art. The Final images showed crowds of community members gathering for the dedication of the completed murals, with Maria speaking about her artwork and her commitment to using her talents for positive community engagement. Lieutenant O'Brien found a folder containing photographs from a domestic violence case that had been resolved through what the case notes described as a comprehensive family intervention approach. The initial photographs showed the aftermath of a violent altercation in the Morrison household, with damaged furniture, broken dishes, and other evidence of the physical confrontation that had brought police to the scene. But the case file also contained photographs documenting the long-term intervention process that had followed the initial arrest. Officer Patricia Rodriguez had worked with the Morrison family over several months, helping them access counseling services, financial assistance, and conflict resolution training that addressed the underlying stresses that had contributed to the violent episode. The later photographs showed the Morrison family participating in community activities, with both parents volunteering for neighborhood improvement projects and their children involved in school and recreational programs that provided positive alternatives to the dysfunction that had previously characterized their household. These images captured moments of genuine family happiness and connection, documenting the transformation that had occurred through patient intervention and community support. The photograph collection also included extensive documentation of crime prevention programs that had been implemented throughout the 1980s and 1990s, showing community meetings, educational programs, and collaborative efforts between police and residents to address local safety concerns. These images provided a visual record of the community policing philosophy that had guided the department's approach during this period. One series of photographs documented a neighborhood watch program that had been established in the Riverside district following a series of residential burglaries. The images showed community members attending training sessions, conducting walking patrols, and participating in social events that strengthened neighborhood relationships while also enhancing security awareness. Success of this program was documented in later photographs that showed declining crime rates, increased property values, and enhanced community cohesion in the Riverside district. The images captured block parties, community garden projects, and other activities that had grown out of the initial focus on crime prevention but had evolved into broader community building efforts. Lieutenant O'Brien pulled another folder, this one containing photographs from a case involving theft from parked cars in the university area. The images showed the systematic approach that Detective Michael Kim had taken to understanding the pattern of thefts, with photographs documenting parking patterns, security vulnerabilities, and the types of items that were being targeted. The investigation had revealed that the thefts were being committed by students who were struggling to afford textbooks and academic supplies, leading Detective Kim to work with university officials to address the underlying problem of educational affordability rather than simply prosecuting the individual thieves. The resolution was documented in photographs showing the establishment of a textbook lending library and an emergency financial assistance program that provided legitimate alternatives to theft for students facing economic hardship. The images showed students working in the lending library, studying with borrowed materials, and participating in financial literacy programs that helped them manage their educational expenses more effectively. The case files also included photographs documenting the broader impact of this intervention, showing reduced theft rates in the university area and increased student engagement with legitimate support services. The success of these programs had been documented through annual reports that included photographic evidence of their continued effectiveness and community support. Moving deeper into the photograph collection, Lieutenant O'Brien found folders containing images from cases that had involved juvenile offenders, documenting the specialized approaches that had been developed for working with young people who had become involved with the criminal justice system. These photographs showed counseling sessions, community service projects, and educational programs that had been designed to address the underlying factors that contributed to juvenile crime. One particularly comprehensive case file documented the work of Officer Jennifer Walsh with a group of teenagers who had been involved in a series of minor vandalism incidents at the local high school. The photographs showed the progression from initial arrest and court appearances through community service assignments and eventually to leadership roles in student government and community volunteer organizations. Transformation documented in these photographs was remarkable, showing young people who had begun as vandals and troublemakers evolving into student leaders and community advocates. Officer Walsh had maintained contact with these young people throughout their high school years and beyond, documenting their continued success in college and careers that reflected the positive impact of the intervention programs. The photograph collection also included extensive documentation of community policing initiatives that had been implemented throughout the 1990s, showing officers participating in school programs, community events, and neighborhood improvement projects. These images captured the philosophy of police work as community service rather than simply law enforcement, documenting the relationships and trust that had been built through sustained engagement and mutual respect. Lieutenant O'Brien spent considerable time reviewing photographs from domestic violence cases, noting the evolution in police response to these situations over the decades. The earlier photographs showed a focus primarily on immediate crisis intervention, while later images documented more comprehensive approaches that included safety planning, counseling referrals, and long-term support for victims and their families. The success of these evolving approaches was visible in photographs, showing domestic violence survivors participating in support groups, completing educational programs, and achieving economic independence that allowed them to leave abusive relationships permanently. These images provided evidence of the effectiveness of comprehensive intervention strategies that addressed both immediate safety needs and long-term empowerment goals. As Lieutenant O'Brien continued her review of the photograph collection, she was struck by the consistency of themes that appeared across different cases and different decades. The most successful interventions were consistently those that addressed underlying social, economic, and personal factors that contributed to criminal behavior, rather than simply focusing on punishment and deterrence. The photograph served as a visual testimony to the power of patient, comprehensive police work that understood crime as a symptom of broader social problems rather than simply individual moral failures. The images documented countless examples of individuals and families who had been helped to address the root causes of their involvement with the criminal justice system, leading to lasting positive changes that benefited both the individuals involved and the broader community. The evidence room maintained not just photographs but also documents, physical evidence, and other materials that constituted the complete historical record of the department's work. Lieutenant O'Brien understood that this collection represented far more than administrative records. It was a repository of institutional wisdom that documented decades of learning about effective police work and community engagement. The quiet atmosphere of the evidence room provided an ideal environment for the kind of reflective review that allowed this institutional wisdom to be preserved and transmitted to future officers. The careful cataloging and preservation of these materials ensured that the lessons learned through decades of police work would remain available to guide future practices and policies. As the night shift continued around her, Lieutenant O'Brien felt the weight of responsibility that came with serving as the custodian of these records. Each photograph, each document, Each piece of evidence represented real people whose lives had been touched by crime and by the police response to that crime. The careful preservation of these materials was a way of honoring both the victims of crime and the officers who had worked to help them heal and move forward. The photographs that lay scattered across her desk told stories of transformation, redemption, and community healing that would continue to inspire and guide police work for generations to come. In the quiet dignity of the evidence room, these visual records rested peacefully, their urgent moments preserved in silver and color, waiting to teach their lessons to anyone willing to look carefully and listen to the stories they contained. The pedestrian bridge that spanned Miller Creek had been built in 1987 as part of the city's downtown revitalization project. Its gentle arch connecting the historic district with the newer commercial developments on the east side of the waterway. During the day, the bridge carried a steady stream of foot traffic, office workers taking lunch breaks, families visiting the downtown shops, tourists exploring the city's historic landmarks. But in the quiet hours after midnight, the bridge became a place of peaceful reflection, its lampposts casting circles of warm light on the wooden planks and steel railings. Detective Captain Susan Martinez found herself drawn to this bridge during her late evening walks, not because of any current case or investigation, but because of the memories it held from a case she had worked 15 years earlier. The bridge had been the site of what the newspapers had called a midnight confrontation, when a troubled teenager named David Chun had threatened to jump into the creek below during a mental health crisis that had brought multiple emergency responders to the scene. Captain Martinez remembered that October night with the clarity that came from cases that had tested every skill she possessed as both a police officer and a human being. David had been standing on the wrong side of the bridge railing when she arrived, his hands gripping the steel bars behind him, his feet balanced precariously on the narrow ledge that separated him from the dark water. 20 feet below, the case had begun earlier that evening when David's parents had called 911 to report that their 17-year-old son had left home, following an argument about his academic performance and future plans. The argument itself had been typical of many teenage conflicts, but David's response had been shaped by an underlying depression that his family had been struggling to understand and address for several months. Captain Martinez, then Sergeant Martinez, had found David on the bridge after a systematic search of locations where he was known to spend time when he needed space to think. Her approach to the situation had been guided by crisis intervention training that emphasized patience, empathy, and the importance of building trust with individuals who were experiencing emotional emergencies. The conversation that had unfolded on the bridge that night had lasted nearly 3 hours, with Captain Martinez gradually establishing the kind of connection that allowed David to express his feelings of hopelessness and confusion about his future. The bridge had provided an intimate setting for this crucial dialogue, isolated enough for privacy, but visible enough for the emergency responders who were standing by to provide assistance if needed. David's crisis had been triggered, not just by the immediate argument with his parents, but by the accumulated pressure of academic expectations, social isolation at school, and his own uncertainty about his identity and goals. The bridge conversation had allowed him to articulate these concerns for the first time, transforming his emotional turmoil into words that could be understood and addressed. The resolution of the crisis had come when David had agreed to step back over the railing and accept transportation to the hospital for evaluation and treatment. But Captain Martinez's involvement with his case had continued for months afterward, as she had worked with his family, school counselors, and mental health professionals to ensure that he received the comprehensive support he needed to address the underlying issues that had led to his suicidal thoughts. The bridge now served as a symbol of hope and renewal rather than crisis and despair. David had graduated from high school, completed college with a degree in social work, and had returned to work as a counselor with the same mental health center that had helped him during his own crisis. Captain Martinez had maintained contact with him over the years, watching his transformation from a troubled teenager to a skilled professional who used his own experience to help other young people navigate similar challenges. The Miller Creek Bridge had become a popular spot for community events and gatherings, its peaceful setting and symbolic significance making it an appropriate venue for activities that celebrated healing and renewal. The annual Mental Health Awareness Walk concluded on the bridge, with speakers sharing stories of recovery and community members expressing their commitment to supporting individuals and families dealing with mental health challenges. Walking across the bridge on this quiet night, Captain Martinez reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in David's life but in the community's understanding of mental health issues. The crisis on the bridge had catalyzed broader conversations about the need for better mental health services, more effective crisis intervention training for police officers, and community-wide approaches to supporting young people who were struggling with depression and anxiety. The downtown area beyond the bridge held its own collection of memories, from cases that had been resolved through patient police work and community cooperation. The alley behind Morrison's Bakery had been the site of a vandalism investigation in 1995 that had been solved through what Detective Robert Kim had called community archaeology, a process of carefully examining the social context of the crimes to understand their underlying motivations. Vandalism had consisted of elaborate graffiti murals that appeared overnight on the walls of buildings throughout the downtown area, always executed with considerable artistic skill, but without permission from property owners. Detective Kim's investigation had focused not just on identifying the vandal, but on understanding the message that the artwork was trying to convey, and the needs that were motivating the unauthorized artistic expression. The breakthrough in the case had come when Detective Kim had realized that the graffiti was not random vandalism, but a coordinated, artistic project that was addressing themes of social justice, environmental protection, and community empowerment. The artist, eventually identified as Maria Rodriguez, a 21-year-old art student, had been using the downtown walls as galleries for artwork that she felt could not be exhibited through traditional venues. The resolution of the case had involved working with Maria, property owners, and community arts organizations to develop a legal public art program that provided appropriate venues for politically engaged artwork while also respecting property rights and community standards. The alley behind Morrison's Bakery had become the site of the first legal mural in this program, a collaborative work that combined Maria's artistic vision with input from community members and local business owners. The success of this approach had led to the establishment of a thriving public arts program that had transformed the downtown area into an outdoor gallery, featuring works by local artists that celebrated the community's history, diversity, and shared values. The alley that had once been the site of criminal investigation had become a destination for art tours and cultural events that brought visitors to the downtown area and supported local businesses. Captain Martinez continued her walk through the downtown streets, each block holding memories of cases that had been resolved through the kind of thoughtful, comprehensive police work that addressed underlying problems rather than simply responding to immediate symptoms. The corner of 5th and Main had been the location of a series of street-level drug sales that had been disrupted, not through mass arrests, but through a community-based intervention that had addressed both supply and demand factors. Detective Lisa Wong had led the investigation that had identified the drug dealers as local residents who had turned to illegal sales because of unemployment and lack of legitimate economic opportunities. Rather than simply arresting the dealers and disrupting their operations temporarily, Detective Wong had worked with community organizations, social services, and local businesses to develop employment and training opportunities that provided legal alternatives to drug dealing. The corner that had once been known for drug activity had been transformed through a combination of increased legitimate foot traffic, improved lighting and landscaping, and the presence of a small business incubator that provided space for entrepreneurs who were committed to serving the local community. The former drug dealers had been among the first participants in the business training program, using skills they had developed through their illegal activities to create legitimate enterprises that served their neighbors. The residential neighborhoods that surrounded the downtown area held their own stories of transformation and renewal, with streets and blocks that had once been characterized by crime and social problems evolving into stable, safe communities through sustained efforts by residents, police, and community organizations. Elm Street in the Riverside District had been the focus of intensive community policing efforts during the early 1990s, when a combination of property crimes, domestic violence, and juvenile delinquency had created an atmosphere of fear and instability that was affecting the quality of life for all residents. Officer Jennifer Martinez had been assigned to work specifically with the Elm Street community, spending months building relationships with residents and understanding the complex social and economic factors that were contributing to the neighborhood's problems. The transformation of Elm Street had been achieved through what Officer Martinez had called social infrastructure development, a process of strengthening the relationships and institutions that allowed neighbors to work together effectively to address shared challenges. This had involved organizing regular community meetings, establishing communication networks that allowed residents to coordinate responses to problems, and creating social activities that brought neighbors together around positive shared experiences. The success of these efforts was visible throughout the neighborhood, with well-maintained properties, active community gardens, and streets where children played safely under the watchful eyes of neighbors who knew and cared about each other's welfare. The corner house that had once been the site of frequent domestic violence calls had become the home of a family that hosted neighborhood barbecues and served as informal mediators when conflicts arose between other residents. The elementary school that served the Elm Street area had become a community center that provided services and activities for residents of all ages, with programs that ranged from after-school tutoring for children to job training and financial literacy classes for adults. The school's transformation had been supported by partnerships with local businesses, social service agencies, and community organizations that recognized the importance of education and social services in maintaining neighborhood stability. Captain Martinez's walk took her past the community center that had been built on the site of a former abandoned warehouse, a building that had once attracted illegal activities, but had been converted into a facility that served as the hub for community organizing and social services. The transformation of this building had been a collaborative effort involving police, residents, city planners, and nonprofit organizations that understood the importance of positive community infrastructure in preventing crime and supporting family stability. The warehouse had originally become a problem location because of its isolated location and lack of legitimate activity, making it attractive to individuals engaged in drug dealing, vandalism, and other illegal activities. But rather than simply increasing police patrols or demolishing the building, community leaders had developed a comprehensive plan for converting the space into a resource that would serve the neighborhood's legitimate needs. The community center now housed a food bank, health clinic, job training programs, and meeting spaces that were used by neighborhood organizations and social groups. The building's design had incorporated security features that prevented unauthorized access while also creating an open, welcoming environment that encouraged community members to use the facility for constructive activities. The parking lot that surrounded the community center had been designed as a gathering space that could accommodate community events, farmers markets, and outdoor activities that brought neighbors together and created the kind of social supervision that naturally discouraged criminal activity. The success of this approach was evident in the vitality and safety that characterized the area, with families using the facility throughout the day and evening hours. The transformation of individual buildings and blocks had contributed to broader changes in the social and economic character of the neighborhoods surrounding the downtown area. Property values had increased as crime rates declined and community cohesion strengthened. But these improvements had been achieved without displacing long-term residents who had worked to improve their neighborhoods. The success of community-based crime prevention efforts had been documented through regular surveys and statistical analyses that showed not just declining crime rates, but also increased community satisfaction, improved property maintenance, and stronger social networks that supported residents during times of personal crisis or economic difficulty. Captain Martinez found herself thinking about the officers who had contributed to these transformations through their patient, dedicated work with individual families and neighborhood organizations. Many of these officers had spent years working in the same communities, developing the kind of deep relationships and local knowledge that made effective community policing possible. Officer David Rodriguez had worked the Riverside District for 8 years, becoming not just a law enforcement presence, but a trusted community resource who helped residents navigate complex social service systems, mediated neighborhood disputes, and connected individuals and families with the assistance they needed to address underlying problems before they escalated into criminal behavior. His approach to police work had emphasized prevention and problem solving rather than reactive enforcement, with extensive time spent on community education, relationship building, and collaborative planning with residents and community organizations. The success of his approach was evident in the trust and respect that community members showed toward police, with residents actively cooperating with investigations and proactively seeking police assistance when problems began to develop. The physical evidence of these successful community policing efforts was visible throughout the neighborhoods that Captain Martinez walked through during her evening reflection. Street lights had been improved not just for security, but to create pleasant environments for evening activities. Parks and recreational areas had been enhanced to provide positive alternatives to risky behaviors for young people. Community gardens had been established in vacant lots that had once attracted illegal dumping and vandalism, transforming these spaces into productive areas that brought neighbors together around shared projects while also improving the neighborhood's appearance and environmental health. The success stories represented by these transformed neighborhoods and buildings provided powerful evidence of the effectiveness of comprehensive approaches to crime prevention and community development. The streets that had once been characterized by fear and social problems had become examples of what was possible when police, residents, and community organizations worked together with patience, creativity, and sustained commitment. As Captain Martinez completed her evening walk and returned to the precinct, she carried with her the knowledge that the city's physical landscape held countless stories of transformation and renewal, evidence of the power of thoughtful police work and community engagement to create lasting positive change. The quiet streets through which she had walked were not just geographic features, but living testimonies to the possibility of healing and growth. Places where the painful memories of past crimes had been transformed into wisdom and strength that would guide future efforts to maintain community safety and social justice. The bridges, corners, buildings, and neighborhoods that made up the city's physical infrastructure had become repositories of institutional and community memory, holding lessons about effective crime prevention and community building. that would continue to inform police work and community development for generations to come. In the peaceful atmosphere of the late evening hours, these places rested quietly, their stories of transformation and renewal adding to the gentle rhythm of a city that had learned to heal its wounds and build its strength through the patient work of individuals and organizations committed to justice, safety, and community welfare. The basement archive stretched deeper than anyone fully realized, beyond the familiar corridors of active case storage into the most remote sections where the oldest resolved cases had found their permanent rest. Chief Detective Patricia Foster had made this journey to the deepest archives only a few times during her 30-year career, drawn by a need to understand the full scope of the institutional memory that surrounded her daily work and to pay her respects to the cases that had shaped the department's understanding of effective police work. The air in these deepest sections carried the weight of decades, thick with the accumulated stories of thousands of investigations that had been brought to their proper conclusions through the patient work of officers who understood that their job was not simply to arrest criminals, but to restore the social harmony that crime had disrupted. Each filing cabinet in these remote corridors held cases that had been closed not just legally but emotionally. Investigations that had concluded with genuine healing for victims, accountability for offenders, and stronger communities that had learned from their experiences with crime and justice. Cabinet 1A contained the oldest files in the collection, cases from the 1960s that had been preserved as examples of the foundational principles that continued to guide the department's work. Chief Foster pulled the first drawer open slowly, feeling the resistance that came from files that had settled into their places over more than half a century of undisturbed rest. The manila folders inside were yellowed with age but still sturdy, their contents preserved with the same care that had characterized their original preparation. The first file she examined documented a case from 1963, when the department had been much smaller and the city had been a different place entirely. The case involved a series of thefts from local businesses that had been solved through what the investigating officer, Detective William Chun, had described as community partnership investigation. The thieves had been identified not through dramatic police work, but through the patient cultivation of relationships with business owners, employees, and regular customers who had provided information because they trusted Detective Chun and believed in his commitment to their welfare. The resolution of the case had involved not just the arrest and prosecution of the individuals responsible for the thefts, but a comprehensive examination of the economic and social factors that had motivated their crimes. Detective Chun had worked with community organizations, social service agencies, and local employers to address the unemployment and poverty that had led young men to turn to theft as a source of income. The file contained follow-up reports, spanning several years, documenting the successful integration of the former thieves into legitimate employment and their contributions to the same community they had once victimized. These reports reflected Detective Chun's understanding that effective police work required sustained engagement with the social conditions that created opportunities for crime, rather than simply responding to criminal acts after they had occurred. Chief Foster found herself moved by the thoroughness and humanity that characterized Detective Chun's approach to police work, qualities that had apparently been valued and encouraged by the department, even in an era when law enforcement was often characterized by more punitive approaches to crime and criminals. The file served as evidence that the community policing philosophy that guided current operations had deep roots in the department's history and institutional culture. The next file dealt with a domestic violence case from 1967, when legal and social responses to family violence were far less developed than they would become in later decades. The case had been handled by Officer Margaret Rodriguez, whose approach had anticipated many of the insights about domestic violence that would not become widely accepted until the 1980s and 1990s. Officer Rodriguez had understood that domestic violence was not simply a private family matter, but a serious crime that required sustained intervention to protect victims and prevent future violence. Her work with the family involved in this case had extended over several months, including regular check-ins with the victim, coordination with social service agencies, and efforts to help the perpetrator understand and address the factors that had led to his violent behavior. The file documented the successful resolution of the case through what Officer Rodriguez had called family system repair, an approach that emphasized accountability for the perpetrator, while also providing comprehensive support for the victim and their children. The long-term follow-up reports showed that the family had remained together and violence-free for more than 5 years after the initial intervention, suggesting that Officer Rodriguez's patient, comprehensive approach had created lasting positive change. These older files consistently demonstrated the department's commitment to understanding crime within its broader social context and addressing the underlying causes of criminal behavior, rather than simply punishing individuals after crimes had been committed. The officers whose work was documented in these archives had apparently understood that effective law enforcement required skills that went beyond traditional police training to encompass counseling, mediation, social work, and community organizing. Chief Foster moved deeper into the archives, pulling files from the 1970s that documented the department's involvement in broader social movements and community development efforts. One particularly comprehensive file dealt with the department's response to racial tensions that had emerged in several neighborhoods during the civil rights era, when economic inequality and social discrimination had created conditions that threatened community stability. The response had been led by Lieutenant David Martinez, who had worked with community leaders, civil rights organizations, and city officials to address not just the immediate tensions, but the underlying inequalities that had created the potential for conflict. His approach had emphasized dialogue, education, and structural changes rather than simply increasing police presence or using enforcement to suppress expressions of community frustration. The file contained extensive documentation of community meetings, educational programs, and policy changes that had been implemented to address discriminatory practices in employment, housing, and public services. Lieutenant Martinez had understood that police could not maintain community safety in an environment where significant portions of the population felt that they were not being treated fairly by social institutions. The success of these efforts was documented in follow-up reports that showed improved relationships between police and minority communities, reduced tensions around racial issues, and increased participation by minority residents in community organizations and civic activities. The approach had required enormous patience and sustained commitment, but it had created lasting improvements in community cohesion and social justice. The archives from the 1980s reflected the department's growing sophistication in addressing complex social problems through collaborative approaches that brought together multiple agencies and community organizations. One file documented a comprehensive response to youth crime that had involved not just police but schools, social services, recreation programs, and community volunteers. The initiative had been developed in response to concerns about increasing juvenile crime rates, but rather than simply increasing arrests and prosecutions, the department had worked with community partners to create positive alternatives for young people who were at risk of becoming involved with criminal activities. The program had included after-school activities, job training and placement services, mentoring relationships between young people and adult community members, and educational programs that helped young people understand the consequences of criminal behavior and develop better decision-making skills. File contained extensive documentation of the program's success, including statistical evidence of reduced juvenile crime rates and qualitative reports from participants, families, and community members about the positive impact of the initiative. Many of the young people who had participated in the program had gone on to complete their education, find stable employment, and become community leaders who worked to provide similar opportunities for the next generation. As Chief Foster continued her exploration of the archives, she began to notice consistent themes that appeared across different decades and different types of cases. The most successful police work was consistently characterized by patience, comprehensive problem-solving, and sustained engagement with the social conditions that created opportunities for crime. The officers whose work was documented in these files had understood that their role extended beyond simple law enforcement to encompass community building, social healing, and the restoration of relationships that had been damaged by crime and conflict. They had apparently been given the time, resources, and institutional support necessary to engage in this kind of comprehensive police work. The files also documented the importance of institutional memory and the preservation of lessons learned through experience. Many of the successful approaches documented in earlier cases had been refined and improved over time, with each generation of officers building on the wisdom accumulated by their predecessors. The archives served not just as historical records, but as repositories of practical knowledge about effective police work and community engagement. The cases documented in these files provided guidance for current officers who were facing similar challenges, demonstrating that many of the problems that seemed new and unprecedented had actually been addressed successfully in earlier decades. Chief Foster pulled a file from the 1990s that documented one of the department's most ambitious community policing initiatives, a comprehensive approach to neighborhood revitalization that had transformed one of the city's most troubled areas into a model of community safety and social cohesion. The initiative had been led by Captain Robert Kim, who had worked with residents, business owners, community organizations, and city agencies to address not just crime, but the underlying conditions of poverty, unemployment, and social isolation that had made the neighborhood vulnerable to criminal activity. The approach had required several years of sustained effort, but the results had been remarkable. Crime rates had declined dramatically, property values had increased, new businesses had opened, and the neighborhood had developed the kind of social infrastructure that supported families and prevented problems before they could escalate into criminal behavior. File contained extensive documentation of the methods that had been used to achieve these results, including detailed descriptions of community organizing techniques, collaborative planning processes, and innovative partnerships between police and community organizations. The success of the initiative had influenced the department's approach to community policing throughout the city and had been studied by law enforcement agencies in other communities that were facing similar challenges. The most recent files in the archives documented the department's continued evolution and adaptation to changing social conditions and community needs. These cases reflected the ongoing commitment to the principles that had guided effective police work for decades, while also incorporating new understanding about issues like mental health, addiction, domestic violence, and youth development. One particularly comprehensive file documented a restorative justice program that had been implemented for certain types of cases where victims, offenders, and community members could work together to address the harm caused by crime and develop plans for preventing future incidents. The program had been successful in cases ranging from property crimes to domestic violence, providing alternatives to traditional criminal justice processes that emphasized punishment and deterrence. The restorative justice approach had proved particularly effective in cases involving young offenders, where the focus on accountability, learning, and community repair had led to very low rates of repeat offenses. As Chief Foster completed her journey through the archives, she found herself surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations of police officers who had understood that their work was fundamentally about serving human communities and promoting the conditions that allowed people to live together peacefully and productively. The files that surrounded her represented thousands of individual cases, but they also told a larger story about the possibility of justice, healing, and social transformation through patient, dedicated public service. Each case that had been brought to successful resolution had contributed to the community's reservoir of experience and wisdom about addressing crime and conflict constructively. The quiet dignity of the archives reflected the nature of the work that was documented within them. These were not stories of dramatic confrontations or heroic interventions, but rather accounts of ordinary people doing extraordinary work through sustained commitment to principles of justice, compassion, and community service. The basement archives would continue to grow as new cases were resolved and filed away, each one adding to the institutional memory that guided the department's work and preserved the lessons that had been learned through decades of patient service to the community. As Chief Foster made her way back through the corridors of filing cabinets toward the elevator that would carry her back to the active world of current investigations and ongoing cases, she carried with her a renewed sense of the continuity and purpose that connected her work to the larger tradition of public service that these archives represented. The stories contained in these files would continue to provide guidance and inspiration for future officers, demonstrating that effective police work was not about dramatic action or individual heroism, but about the patient, sustained effort to understand and address the complex social conditions that affected community safety and welfare. The archives rested in their quiet dignity, their stories complete but their wisdom eternal, ready to guide and inspire the next generation of officers who would carry forward the tradition of service that had been preserved in these carefully maintained files. In the deepest peace of the archives, where justice had been served and healing had begun, the final files waited in perfect stillness. Their cases closed not with violence or drama, but with the gentle satisfaction that comes when communities have been restored and relationships have been healed through the patient work of those who understand that law enforcement is ultimately about love of community, love of justice, and love of the possibility that people can change and grow and find their way back to the light. The silence of the archives was not empty but full, pregnant with all the stories of transformation and renewal that would continue to unfold in the streets and neighborhoods above, guided by the wisdom that rested peacefully in these deepest vaults of institutional memory, where every investigation had found its resolution and every story had discovered its peace. Asterisk. The clock tower of the old courthouse chimed 5:30 in the morning as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the high windows of the central precinct. The building itself seemed to exhale slowly, settling deeper into the peaceful rhythm that had characterized the night hours while simultaneously preparing for the gradual awakening that would bring the day shift and renewed activity to its corridors and offices. Lieutenant Sarah Chun stood at the window of her third-floor office, watching the sky lighten incrementally over the city that had rested safely under the care of the night watch. In another hour and a half, the building would come alive with the energy of officers arriving for day shift, the bustle of morning briefings, and the immediate demands of a community beginning its daily activities. But for now, in these quiet transition hours, There was time for reflection and for the careful completion of the night's work. Asterisk. The night shift report that Lieutenant Chun was preparing would document 8 hours of police work that had been characterized not by dramatic incidents or urgent crises, but by the steady, patient attention to community welfare that represented the department's highest ideals. 3 domestic disturbance calls had been resolved through mediation and resource referral. 2 traffic accidents had been handled with careful attention to both safety and the emotional needs of the drivers involved. 1 welfare check on an elderly resident had resulted in connecting the person with medical assistance and family support. These were not the kinds of cases that would generate newspaper headlines or television coverage, but they represented the daily work of maintaining the social fabric that allowed community life to function smoothly and safely. Each incident had been handled with the same thorough attention and commitment to comprehensive problem solving that characterized the department's approach to more serious crimes, reflecting an understanding that effective police work was fundamentally about preventing small problems from escalating into larger crises. The patrol officers who had worked through the night were completing their own reports in the quiet spaces throughout the building, documenting their observations and interactions with the same careful attention to detail that would allow day shift officers to understand the community's current needs and concerns. Officer Rodriguez was finishing his report on a noise complaint that had been resolved through conversation with college students who had been unaware that their late-night study group was disturbing neighbors. Officer Kim was documenting her response to a report of suspicious activity that had turned out to be a new resident who was unfamiliar with the neighborhood's parking regulations. These reports would become part of the continuous narrative of community policing that connected each shift to the next, ensuring that the knowledge gained through direct contact with residents was preserved and shared among all officers who served the same neighborhoods. The careful documentation of even minor incidents contributed to the department's understanding of community patterns and needs, providing the foundation for proactive approaches to maintaining safety and preventing crime. Detective Martinez was using these quiet morning hours to review case files and prepare briefing materials for the day shift detectives who would continue investigations that had been initiated during evening hours. A burglary investigation that had begun with a late-night report would be continued by officers who specialized in property crimes. A missing person case that had been resolved successfully during the night would be documented thoroughly to ensure that all agencies and family members were properly notified of the positive outcome. The detective work conducted during night hours often focused on this kind of careful case management and inter-shift coordination rather than active investigation. But this behind-the-scenes work was essential for maintaining the continuity and effectiveness of complex investigations that might span days or weeks. Detective Martinez took particular satisfaction in ensuring that cases were handed off smoothly between shifts, with all relevant information clearly documented and available to the officers who would carry the investigations forward. The evidence room in the basement was staffed throughout the night by Technician Anderson, whose responsibilities included not only maintaining the security and environmental conditions that protected stored evidence, but also processing any new materials that were collected during overnight operations. The night hours provided ideal conditions for the detailed, meticulous work that evidence processing required, allowing Technician Anderson to give each item the careful attention that might be crucial for successful prosecutions. The climate-controlled environment of the evidence room created a sense of timelessness that seemed appropriate for the work of preserving the physical record of police investigations. Each item that was processed and stored represented a moment when the criminal justice system had gathered information that would contribute to the pursuit of truth and justice. and the careful preservation of these materials honored both the victims of crime and the officers who had worked to address their cases. The communication center maintained its 24-hour operation with the same quiet efficiency that characterized all aspects of night shift work. Dispatcher Thompson had handled 17 calls during the night, each one processed with the same professional attention, regardless of whether it involved a serious emergency or a minor request for information. The communication center served as the crucial link between community members seeking assistance and the officers who provided that assistance. And the quality of this communication often determined the effectiveness of police response. The technology that supported police communications had evolved significantly over the decades, but the fundamental responsibility remained the same: ensuring that citizens could reach police when they needed help and that officers had the information they needed to respond appropriately. Dispatcher Thompson understood that her calm, professional demeanor during emergency calls could help stabilize crisis situations, and that her careful attention to detail in routine communications contributed to the overall effectiveness of police operations. As dawn approached, the administrative staff who supported police operations began arriving for their early shifts, bringing with them the energy and activity that would characterize the building's daytime operations. Court liaison officers arrived to prepare for morning arraignments and hearings. Records clerks began the process of filing and organizing the previous day's paperwork. Community relations staff prepared for scheduled meetings and public events. The transition from night to day shift represented more than just a change in personnel. It reflected the continuous nature of police service and the commitment to community safety that transcended individual shifts or particular officers. The building itself seemed to embody this continuity, its architecture and infrastructure designed to support police operations around the clock while also serving as a symbol of the community's commitment to the rule of law and public safety. Morning briefing room was prepared by Sergeant Williams, who arranged the materials and information that would guide day shift officers as they assumed responsibility for community protection. The briefing would include updates on ongoing investigations, information about community events that might require police attention, and any specific concerns or priorities that had emerged during the night hours. These briefings served not only to transfer practical information between shifts but also to reinforce the department's values and priorities, ensuring that all officers understood their role in the larger mission of community service and public safety. Sergeant Williams took particular care to highlight positive interactions and successful problem-solving from the previous shift, recognizing that these examples helped establish and maintain the culture of professionalism and community engagement that characterized the department's approach. The parking lot outside the precinct began to show signs of the changing shift as night officers completed their paperwork and prepared to head home for rest, while day shift officers arrived and prepared for their briefings and assignments. The physical transition mirrored the continuous cycle of service that ensured community safety was maintained without interruption, regardless of the time of day or the particular individuals who were on duty. Officer Park, completing her night shift patrol, took time to walk through the neighborhood she had served during the overnight hours, observing the gradual awakening of the community as residents prepared for their daily activities. Porch lights were being turned off as natural daylight increased. Early commuters were beginning to appear on the sidewalks and in their vehicles. The transition from the quiet rhythms of night to the busier pace of day was occurring smoothly and safely under the watchful care of police officers who understood their role as guardians of this daily renewal. The community's trust in police protection was most evident during these transition hours, when residents felt secure enough to sleep through the night, knowing that trained Professionals were maintaining vigilance on their behalf. This trust had been earned through decades of dedicated service and was maintained through the daily demonstration of competence, integrity, and genuine concern for community welfare. The morning sun rose fully above the horizon as Lieutenant Chun completed her night shift report and prepared to transfer responsibility to Lieutenant Foster, who would supervise day shift operations. The handoff between supervisors included not only the practical details of ongoing investigations and immediate concerns, but also the intangible but crucial transfer of responsibility for community safety and welfare. Lieutenant Foster arrived at the precinct with the energy and readiness that characterized day shift operations, but also with respect for the work that had been accomplished during the night hours and appreciation for the continuity of service that connected all shifts in common purpose. Her briefing with Lieutenant Chun reflected the key of a collaborative approach that ensured community safety was maintained through seamless coordination between different officers and different shifts. The day shift officers who filled the briefing room brought with them the enthusiasm and commitment that would guide their service throughout the coming day. But they also carried forward the institutional wisdom and community knowledge that had been accumulated through decades of police work. Each officer understood that they were part of a larger tradition of public service that extended far beyond their individual contributions and that connected them to both their predecessors and their successors in the ongoing work of community protection. The morning briefing itself was conducted with the same attention to detail and commitment to excellence that characterized all aspects of police work, but it also reflected the understanding that effective law enforcement required not just technical competence, but also emotional intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and genuine commitment to the welfare of all community members. As the day shift officers dispersed to their assignments and the night shift personnel departed for their well-deserved rest, the precinct building continued its eternal vigil over the community it served. The cycle of day and night shifts represented more than just an administrative convenience. It embodied the community's commitment to continuous protection and service that recognized no boundaries of time or circumstance. The archives in the basement would continue to grow as new cases were resolved and documented, adding to the institutional memory that guided police work and preserved the lessons learned through experience. The evidence room would continue to protect the physical record of investigations, while new cases generated additional materials requiring careful processing and storage. The communication center would continue to serve as the vital link between community members and police services, handling each call with the same professional attention, regardless of the hour or the nature of the request. The administrative systems would continue to support field operations through careful documentation, scheduling, and coordination that ensured resources were available when and where they were needed. The community itself would continue its daily cycle of activities, work, and rest, secure in the knowledge that dedicated professionals were maintaining the conditions that allowed ordinary life to proceed safely and peacefully. Children would walk to school, adults would go to work, families would gather for meals and recreation, all under the protective umbrella of police service that operated continuously and largely invisibly in the background of daily life. The trust that made this community life possible had been built through decades of reliable, professional service and was maintained through the daily demonstration that police officers understood their role as servants of the community rather than its masters. This trust was perhaps the most valuable asset that the department possessed, and its preservation required constant attention to the principles of integrity, competence, and genuine care for community welfare. As the morning light filled the precinct building and the day shift assumed full responsibility for community protection, the eternal cycle of police service continued its unbroken rhythm. The night watch had completed its responsibilities with the same dedication and professionalism that had characterized police work in this community for generations. And the day watch would carry forward the same commitment to excellence and service. The stories that had unfolded during the night hours would become part of the larger narrative of community policing, adding to the accumulated experience and wisdom that guided all police work. Some of these stories would be remembered and retold as examples of effective problem-solving or community engagement, while others would fade into the background of routine professional service. But all would contribute to the ongoing development of institutional knowledge and community trust. The precinct building itself stood as a symbol of the community's commitment to the rule of law and public safety. Its architecture and infrastructure designed to support police operations, while also serving as a visible reminder of the social contract that connected law enforcement to the citizens it served. The building would continue to shelter the work of police service through day and night, through routine and crisis, through all the varied circumstances that shaped community life. In the gentle transition from night to day, from one watch to another, from rest to activity, the eternal rhythm of police service continued its unbroken cycle. The community slept safely and awakened securely, protected by the dedication of professionals who understood that their work was not just a job, but a calling to serve something larger than themselves. The sun climbed higher in the morning sky, bringing with it the promise of another day of service, another opportunity to demonstrate the values of integrity, competence, and compassion that defined effective police work. The night had passed peacefully under the careful watch of dedicated officers, and the day would unfold under the same protective care, ensuring that the community's trust in its guardians would be honored and preserved for generations to come. And so the eternal cycle continued, night flowing into day, one watch transferring responsibility to the next, all united in the common purpose of serving and protecting the community that had placed its trust in their hands. In this rhythm of continuous service, in this unbroken chain of dedication and care, the true meaning of police work was revealed, not as a profession of power or authority, but as a calling to love and serve, to protect and heal, to maintain the delicate balance that allowed human communities to flourish in safety and peace. The stories would continue, each shift bringing new opportunities to serve, new challenges to meet with wisdom and courage, new moments when the training and dedication of police officers would be tested and proven worthy of the trust that had been placed in them. And in the quiet satisfaction of service well performed, in the peaceful transition from one watch to another, in the gentle rhythm of day and night that marked the eternal cycle of protection and care, the deepest meaning of these crime stories for sleep was finally revealed, that true security comes not from strength or fear, but from love of community, love of justice, love of the sacred trust that connects those who serve with those they are called to protect.